Ultra smirked inwardly, bored by how long Mars was taking to learn a single skill. But what he didn't understand was that Mars, the black-haired man, had to struggle hard to master any skill. Mars sat on the floor, panting, surrounded by hundreds of books and papers. As he tried to focus, he heard Gordon and Ultra whispering outside the door and wondered why they were there. This man, skill lender Mars, a member of the S-rank team known as the Sword of Divine Silver, began to feel even more surprised when two girls named Elia and Tina walked down the hallway and asked what was going on. Mars grew even more puzzled as more people gathered outside the room where he was. These individuals were all members of the same team. Ultra is a swordsman with countless skills, such as the slashing technique Slash Attack, the spell Hawk's Eyes, and the lightning-fast Godspeed sword technique of the Holy Blade. Elia, a princess sorceress, wields knowledge skills that allow her to use ancient magic, with the ability to cast spells quickly and self-recover, enabling her to use these skills in battle. Gordon, a former royal palace gatekeeper, uses the hardening skill Obsidian, making him a fortress with physical enchantments, along with the fast-moving skill Instant Footwork for high agility. Tina is the Holy Maiden of Healing, using the recovery skill Wings of the Angel, which can even bring the dead back to life. With their powerful and unique skills, these four form an extraordinary combination in the S-rank team alongside Mars. However, Mars felt like an ordinary man because he only had one skill, Skill Lender. Although he once had another skill, it was no longer his, as he had lent all his abilities to his teammates. For this reason, Mars needed knowledge and training to learn new skills, which is why he had a private study room. For some reason, that room gradually turned into a storage space. Outside the room, people began talking about Mars, saying borrowing skills from him was a waste of time. Even with the borrowed skills, Elia already had enough abilities. They went on to say that the gap in talent between them and Mars was too great, and it would be better if Mars was no longer in the group. They believed Mars was no longer useful or needed for the team. The black-haired boy sat on his knees, covering his ears, his body trembling with anger as he heard the insults whispered about him. Mars took a deep breath and realized it was time for him to truly leave. 3 years ago, his fate took a turn when his team recklessly challenged a high-ranking warden without proper preparation. They were lucky to win, but Ultra and the others believed they succeeded on their own strength, refusing to listen to anything Mars had to say. From that moment, Mars realized the talent gap was real, and he knew it was likely he'd be asked to leave the team after their next adventure in the labyrinth. Finally, he stepped out of his room and announced he was ready to lend them his skills. However, they all looked at Mars with annoyance because he had taken too long. The black-haired boy bowed his head in dejection. Before beginning to lend them the 12 skills he had learned, activating his skill, a blinding light filled the hallway. They were asked to choose their skills, and a list of information appeared, beginning to transfer into the other members of the team. When it was over, everyone barely glanced at the new skills they had received and quickly mentioned it was time to head into the dungeon. This left Mars deeply disappointed. He walked away with a sad expression, because none of them even said a word of thanks. Mars entered the dining hall, realizing he had forgotten to eat, while busy studying new skills. When his food arrived, he noticed it had been prepared by his team. But when he opened the bowl, all he saw was water and a piece of moldy bread from a few days ago. Ultra laughed loudly at the sight and lied to Mars, saying they were trying to cut costs. However, Mars knew the truth, that the rest of the group was probably eating meat without him. The next day, the group set off on their journey to the S-rank dungeon, the Abyss of Demons. Ultra announced he would use his Holy Sword skill and ordered everyone to stay out of its range. He also told Mars to lie on the ground and not move. Elia laughed loudly, saying she expected nothing from Mars other than staying out of the way, and asked him not to become a burden. The long-haired swordsman activated his technique, and it swiftly swept through the small monsters ahead. Mars sighed as he watched, knowing that the Holy Sword skill wasn't the only ability Ultra was using to help him. Learning a skill is like operating a water wheel. The more water, the faster the wheel spins. And the more a skill is used, the stronger it becomes. However, unique skills like Mars's Skill Lender rarely appear between the ages of 8 and 12, and they have distinct properties and effects unlike any other skills. Mars's ability was one of these unique skills, and even when he learned a skill, only others could activate it perfectly. With the support spells he had learned, if Mars swung a sword, the power would be weak. But if he lent the skill to someone like Ultra, the effect would be tenfold. Mars always believed he had to learn many skills to contribute, driving him to work tirelessly until he was invited to join the Divine Silver team because of his unique skill. Ultra stepped forward and stomped hard on Mars's head, scolding him for dirtying the luggage, and yelling at the boy before storming off in anger. They continued deeper into the dungeon, and Ultra wondered aloud if this was truly the S-rank dungeon they had heard about. Elia agreed, saying the traps didn't seem to be affecting them at all. Mars followed behind the group, glaring at their backs with fury in his eyes. He knew the floor they were standing on was filled with paralyzing poison, strong enough to affect even the most powerful individuals. However, thanks to the sacrifices of many, the anti-poison skill had been discovered, and Mars had learned it and lent it to the others. None of them knew this, and it didn't matter because they wouldn't listen to Mars even if he tried to explain. Arguing was a waste of time. What mattered more to Mars was keeping a safe distance. While the others joked that he was afraid, Mars knew that his protective effect on them would disappear if they got too far. If Mars moved just 3 steps further, the 2 people laughing in front of him would pass out from the poison, but it wouldn't bother him. Mars kept his emotions in check. The group suddenly encountered a fork in the path, and Ultra shouted at Mars, demanding he use a skill to help them. Mars explained there was a skill called Scout's Intuition, but Ultra kept yelling, demanding that Mars explain every skill to him, or else he'd cut Mars's share of the money. However, Mars knew Ultra wouldn't listen, so he kept apologizing without resisting. Mars quietly thought that he should pray for Ultra's mood to improve once they returned to the surface. When the swordsman activated the mentioned skill, a large surge of energy was felt from one of the paths, catching Ultra's attention. Elia asked him what he saw, and Ultra explained that the door on the right was the correct way to go, but he also admitted they were about to face a formidable enemy. The group finally came across a large door bearing the symbol of a dragon. Mars stared at it with both fear and excitement. This grand symbol surely meant they had reached the boss room, and Mars knew that the sacrifices of many who died here weren't in vain, thanks to the knowledge left behind by those who came before. However, no one else in the group shared those thoughts or feelings, as all they cared about was themselves and the fact that they had reached the boss room. Mars was pulled from his thoughts by Ultra, who said he would explain the plan to him. Mars was confused, as his only role so far had been to sit in a corner and do nothing. But Ultra explained that he wanted Mars to have the honor of being the vanguard, sending a shiver of fear down Mars's spine. Being the vanguard meant Mars would have to charge into the boss room first, something he hadn't expected. Mars felt alone, and being the vanguard often meant death, especially in an unpredictable dungeon like this, where he knew how weak he truly was. He looked back at the others in confusion, wondering why they were asking him to do this, until it dawned on him that Ultra was trying to avoid paying severance. The severance payment a person received when leaving the team increased each year, and Mars had just entered his 7th year with the group. Ultra knew the payout would be substantial for Mars, because adventuring was a dangerous job, but Mars had reached his limit and could no longer endure it. He turned to ask Tina, Gordon, and Elia if they agreed with Ultra's plan, and they all agreed without hesitation. Mars stood there in shock, unable to believe they could so easily discard the 6 years he had spent with them. Everything he had done seemed meaningless. Ultra explained that keeping someone without talent was a burden, and having Mars in the group was a loss. He said the group had decided that after this dungeon, they would be reborn as a true S-rank team, without Mars. Mars bowed his head, darkness covering his face, as he recalled how he once thought he should support an S-rank team to serve the world and find happiness for himself. But from the start, that was never true. The black-haired boy listened to every word from Ultra, until he made one final request. This caused Ultra to look annoyed. Mars raised his head and asked everyone to return all the skills they had borrowed from him. Everyone immediately looked confused, until Mars explained that the skills would lose their effect once he died. So he wanted the chance to deal some damage to the boss, if this was truly the time he had to die. Ultra laughed loudly before agreeing, and asked what they needed to do to return the skills. Mars activated his skill and said they just needed to say they were returning the skills. One by one, they did as he asked, and within seconds, he felt the process of returning begin, hearing the voices of the young girls echo in his mind. The group asked if it was done, and Mars confirmed it. He then asked if they remembered the interest rate of a skill called Toi Chi, which had an interest rate of 10% every 10 days. Elia stepped forward and said she remembered, stating it was no problem, because their SP pool was so large. She assumed they might lose a skill or two, but believed it would only be skills she rarely used. Gordon and Tina agreed, saying they had accounted for the loss of borrowed skills and saw no issue with what would happen. However, Mars knew they had all made a grave mistake. Finally, he told Elia, That the interest he calculated was compound interest, not simple interest, which left everyone even more confused. As the girl pondered, Mars explained that their base SP stayed the same, but every 10 days, 10% was added to the original amount, and that interest had grown exponentially over the years. Ultra still didn't fully grasp the explanation and didn't believe there was an issue. He moved forward, forcefully grabbing Mars' luggage so he could fight the boss immediately. Meanwhile, Elia began recalculating everything, and her eyes widened in horror as she realized the actual amount they owed him after all this time. Mars saw the look on Elia's face as she figured out the truth, and he smirked evilly, knowing this was inevitable from a genius sorceress like her. Suddenly, Ultra approached from behind. Ultra raised his foot and kicked Mars through the door leading to the boss room. Mars stumbled forward into the room, and as the door began to close, Elia ran toward him, crying out, but it was too late. The door shut, and the process of collecting all the interest from the past 6 years began. Mars felt excruciating pain shoot through his body. As the interest retrieval took place, he collapsed to the floor, clutching his stomach and head, blood pouring from his mouth, and felt his consciousness fading. As a secret safety mechanism activated, Mars found himself standing in a blank white void, naked but feeling no cold. He began walking around, realizing he was completely alone in this space, yet oddly, he didn't feel worried. A voice echoed, announcing that the transfer to the protective zone had been confirmed, leaving Mars confused. He wondered where he had been transported, and the voice answered, explaining that this place was inside his mind. His brain had been severely damaged due to the massive amount of skills he had just recovered. Mars was surprised to learn he could communicate with the voice of the skill, and the voice explained that its personality had been pre-configured, though it had no physical form. Hearing this, Mars asked who had configured it, but the voice didn't answer that question. Instead, it said the skill recovery process was almost complete and that Mars would soon wake up. The voice continued, saying it had watched over Mars more than anyone else, and prayed that from now on, Mars would achieve greatness and shine brightly. Mars felt moved, as he had always thought no one noticed his efforts, even when he desperately cared for others. But it turned out that someone had been watching over him all along. Mars' brain had been completely healed, meaning he was about to wake up, along with all his newly recovered skills. But just before leaving, Mars asked the voice for its name. This time he received an answer, Yue. Meanwhile, Elia desperately begged Ultra to enter the boss room immediately. Everyone thought she wanted to save Mars, but she urged them to kill Mars as quickly as possible. Ultra looked down at her in confusion, thinking what she said was strange, since Mars would soon die anyway. Finally, he smirked and said that while he knew she was a genius, they still had something called common sense. However, Elia's body started to weaken, her breathing becoming labored. She collapsed to the floor, drenched in sweat and coughing, struggling to speak about how the poison had begun affecting her. Everyone stared in shock until they, too, began feeling the effects of the poison. One by one, they fell to the ground, clutching their bodies. Tina couldn't understand why there was poison here in the first place, and Ultra realized that Tina's Wings of the Angel skill wasn't working. Within seconds, the entire group lay unconscious on the floor. Meanwhile, Mars slowly woke up, realizing that the boss hadn't attacked him during that time. Though Mars felt like a long time had passed, it had only been a brief moment. He looked around and noticed the room was pitch black and eerily silent. Mars decided to take his time reviewing all the skills he had gained. To better observe his surroundings, he activated God's Eye and Scout's Intuition. In front of him, he saw a throne, and something was sitting on it. A serpent dragon named Vritra. Mars knew that unless he defeated it, the dungeon wouldn't be conquered, and he wouldn't be able to start making real money with his newly acquired skills. He recalled a long-forgotten piece of information, that Vritra was a white dragon that couldn't be killed by any technique or weapon. However, his train of thought was cut short when the giant serpent lunged at him. Mars quickly dodged, as it whipped its body to attack, but Mars was already prepared to counter. He blocked its attack, and in a flash, he grabbed the serpent's body and slammed it into the wall. If it had been a normal monster, it would have died long ago. But this was no ordinary monster. Yue's voice echoed again, asking if Mars wanted to move to the next step. Mars agreed immediately, and decided to use Elia's skill, Wisdom of the Ancient. He raised his hand, light enveloping his body as he activated the skill, Songs of the God, and learned the skill, Cositus, amplified by several other abilities. As the energy gathered, Mars recalled something someone had once said, that mastering skills was about controlling this energy. With that thought, Mars unleashed his attack, blasting Vritra into pieces. However, Vritra wasn't truly dead and began trying to regenerate its body by reassembling its shattered parts. But Mars didn't let that happen. He decided to freeze each fragment of Vritra, sealing its ability to resurrect. Mars used the skill Spatial Jump to extend the range of his power, beyond the world, even into the universe known as the Sea of Stars, before sending Vritra's fragments into the endless void, where the ice would take 1,000 years to melt. As the dungeon began to collapse, signaling its conquest, Mars noticed that Ultra and the others were still paralyzed by the poison. However, he believed the extraction team would likely help them before the dungeon completely crumbled. Just before Mars left, after collecting the materials from the boss, he noticed something else in the room. An egg of Vritra. Mars picked up the egg and considered destroying it, but then he thought the only thing that could stop Vritra was another Vritra. He decided to raise the creature when it hatched, asking Yue if she had any objections. The voice didn't object but respected Mars's choice, calling it interesting. Mars smirked, feeling it was the first time anyone had said something like that to him. He then used the skill Spatial Jump to escape the dungeon, and for the first time, Mars made his way out entirely on his own. Mars was the first of the group to exit the dungeon under the clear blue sky. He rewarded himself with a warm bowl of soup without anyone yelling at him. Mars placed Vritra's egg, the treasure he had found and brought back from the dungeon, into a large bag, then put his hand on his hip, staring at the town he had been tied to for so long. A gentle breeze swept through the air, and the black-haired boy knew it was time for him to leave and begin a new journey elsewhere. Ultra and the others were still underground, but Mars had already completed the process of withdrawing from the guild, receiving his severance pay along with the rewards. Before leaving the inn, Mars called out to Yue and said he wanted to create a body for her. Yue responded, trying to tell Mars that she believed one day a beautiful girl would come into his life. However, Mars explained that she had misunderstood. He simply wanted to thank Yue for helping him all this time. Mars asked Yue how she wanted her body to look. After a moment of hesitation, Yue remained silent for a while before admitting that she wanted to be able to touch Mars with her own hands, and asked if that was possible. Mars knew that creating life from nothing was impossible, but during his time in the protective zone, he realized that some skills could create a body without consciousness. However, this time there was already a consciousness, thanks to Yue, and that could help Mars transfer her into a physical form. Mars activated the Lender skill and took Tina's Wings of the Angel skill, then evolved it into Blessing of the Seraph. This evolution was enough to create a fully formed human from scratch. He told Yue to get ready to transfer herself into the real world, and she complied, adjusting every fiber of her new body. Mars raised his hand, and the body of a woman began forming from the air. The process quickly completed, and Yue in her new form quietly leaned on Mars, before her eyes slowly opened. For the first time she spoke, asking Mars if she could ask 2 questions. Mars gently set her down and agreed to answer. Yue explained that she had only called Mars human all this time, and asked what she should call him now that she had a body in the real world. Mars said his name was enough, but Yue believed that was inappropriate, as Mars was both her creator and master, according to the knowledge she had gathered. Yue decided to call Mars Master, and struck a cute pose while saying it, causing Mars to quickly ask her to just say Master in a normal way. After realizing Yue had likely picked up these ideas from when Gordon snuck into a maid cafe, Mars felt confused. Yue's second question was about her lack of clothes, which made Mars anxious since he had forgotten such an important detail. It wasn't just about appearances. The right armor would increase her healing abilities thanks to the enhanced Wings of the Angel skill, boosted by the range enchantment spell. However, he couldn't create clothes from thin air. Mars quickly searched his inventory and found a spare set of clothes for Yue to wear, although she mentioned she didn't mind staying as she was. Yue smiled happily, admitting the clothes smelled like master, making Mars chuckle softly, but also reminding her not to express herself that way in the human world. Since Yue still had little grasp of reality, they would both need to learn together slowly. With that settled, they embarked on a new journey to find a place to raise Vritra. They needed to find a location far from the city, as Vritra was a giant serpent and Mars was tired of social interactions. Before they left, Yue encountered a small problem. She didn't know which foot to step with first. Mars knew this journey would be long with her by his side. Along the way, Mars had already acquired 2 unique skills from the Sword of the Divine Silver group, leaving only Ultra's Sword Saint skill and Gordon's Obsidian skill. But there was no rush. he would reclaim what belonged to him. Meanwhile, Ultra and the others were sitting in a bar. Ultra, with his long hair, was boasting about how he had used his skill to slash the frozen giant serpent into pieces, until Mars betrayed the group, ruining their glorious victory. It was all a blatant lie, but Ultra continued to maintain his false image. When someone asked about the boss's body, the people around them began wondering how Mars could have defeated 4 S-rank members, and they started discussing possible explanations. Fortunately for Ultra, they still believed his group was stronger than Mars, and there had to be another reason. Tina was impressed by how easily Ultra's lies were accepted. But what mattered to Ultra was Mars' whereabouts. The 4 of them had been found by the extraction team a week ago, but Mars had left the city 3 days before they woke up, and reported the situation to the guild. Ultra grew angrier after hearing the update from Tina and started shouting at a waitress, demanding more beer. Tina urged him to stop being rude, reminding him that it could damage her reputation and cause trouble with the church. In his anger, Ultra lashed out at Elia, who was quietly eating bread. When Ultra yelled at her to say something, Elia simply pretended to go along with him, saying that dipping bread in corn soup was wonderful. Ultra was confused by Elia's unexpected response, though he agreed the meal was delicious. Yet, Elia continued eating happily, humming to herself and spilling food, further confusing Ultra. Everyone said Elia was a genius, having once written a paper on the multidimensional interpretation of unstable sounds, and possessed a unique intelligence skill that stirred the academic world. But right now, there seemed to be no sign of that brilliance in her. As things began to feel off for Ultra, Mars and Yue walked the wide roads through various lands. Mars explained the world to Yue, like who Duca Beak was and what he did. He asked Yue if she was getting used to walking, and Yue confirmed she was, although she was still adjusting to walking on roads that weren't main pathways. Mars explained that main roads were expected to offer safety and comfort as they connected towns and were used by many, including lords, and were tied to taxes. Yue curiously asked what taxes were, and Mars explained that taxes were the money used to fund things like moving soldiers to slay monsters. One of the towns created to generate this revenue was Kinui, the town they were approaching, with a population of about 100 people. Suddenly, Yue called to him and asked if their story was contradictory, as she looked back and saw corpses following them. Zombies, toxic cats, night hounds, and even flame slimes. Though they could easily use spatial jump during the night camping, Mars wanted to take the time for Yue to learn about everything. Mars had heard that people with skills often emitted unique mana, and he began to believe that his own high SP might have attracted all these monsters. However, Yue heard his thoughts and reassured him that it was fine since they could fend off the monsters with their skills. Yi was impressed and praised Mars for his creativity in activating the spatial jump around the tent, causing the monsters to be flung into the air and crash back down. Still, Mars was concerned about the number of monsters and said they should quickly move on to their destination, the town of Kanui, a place where adventurers mostly rested during their travels. The atmosphere here was very different from the towns they had passed through. At a restaurant, Mars bought a baked treat for Yue, but their exploration was interrupted by the sight of a girl collapsing on the ground, being scolded by a man for being lazy. Mars was surprised when he noticed the girl's ears and tail, realizing she was part of a rare race, the werewolves. Yue asked if werewolves were rare, and Mars confirmed, explaining that they originally lived in the forests around this area until a war with humans drove them from their land. The grasslands surrounding them used to be a forest, but after the war, it fell into human hands, was cut down, and abandoned. The person who took over and developed this ruined land was Duke Abik. Werewolves had great strength in the forest, with sharp fangs and claws, bodies covered in fur, and were blessed by the wolf god, making them a proud race. Yue asked if the girl was really a part of the werewolf stories Mars had heard, and Mars began to believe that the legends might be far different from reality. Mars wondered why a descendant of the werewolves was being treated like a slave, thinking that losing the war might have lowered them below humans. The man called for everyone to come to lunch. The werewolf girl had earned her meal by completing the morning's quota, but the meal was just a bowl of thin soup and a piece of dirty bread. This was the same kind of food Mars had once received when he was in the Sword of Divine Silver group, and it was clear that the other workers had much better meals than the girl. Yui understood what was going through Mars's mind and advised him that if he wanted to help someone in front of him, he shouldn't hesitate, but should act. These words were enough to motivate Mars to intervene, even if it meant staying in the town for another 10 days. Mars requested to meet the boss in the office, and after a short conversation, he approached the werewolf girl. He said he had heard her story and knew that her wage was 3,000 yen for moving all the sacks of wheat into the warehouse. But he also knew the workload she had was impossible to complete in a day. The girl said that 300 yen was deducted each day for food, and Mars interrupted, pointing out that the money only covered a bowl of thin soup. His words made the girl glare at him, asking what he wanted from her. Mars was impressed by her strong, determined gaze, even in her poor condition. Her eyes still held some of the pride Mars had heard about in the legends of the werewolves. At first, Mars intended to give her a little money and leave, but he decided to do something different. He offered the girl 600 yen from her wages, and in return, she would earn 10 times more than what she was making now. Mars had heard that her skill was enhancing the strength in her legs, and he offered to extend the duration of the skill for weeks, allowing her to move all the wheat sacks by the next day. She sat silently, thinking about the offer, while Mars continued explaining, drawing out the costs on the ground, and asked if she understood the numbers. This made her feel insulted, thinking he was underestimating her intelligence, and Mars realized she had been properly raised, which made him even more curious as to why she was in this situation. He began to wonder if she was being exploited by someone. After Mars explained the details of the deal, he left the decision to her. However, the girl responded that she could complete the work faster, even without taking his money. Mars knew that not taking her money wasn't how he wanted things to go, but he agreed anyway. He told Yue to prepare for the skill transfer. He activated the skill lender and began the lending process while realizing he needed to introduce himself. So he introduced himself as Mars and asked her name. She responded that her name was Shizuku. Mars lent Shizuku the skill to extend her stamina, and she stood up in surprise, immediately feeling the change in her body. Once the process was complete, Mars gave her a pastry that he and Yue had bought from a local shop as a token of their cooperation. When Mars asked if Shizuku's lunch break was over, she was startled and hurried off to resume her work. Yue observed and asked Mars why he charged the girl instead of helping for free. Mars explained that there was still pride in Shizuku's eyes, and she wouldn't accept help if it was out of pity. Later that same day, Shizuku quickly finished her work and went to collect her wages. As she left, she thanked Mars, and Mars thought about her potential, advising her to find a better job and earn more money by the 10th day, when she'd need to repay the loan. Shizuku handed Mars the 600 yen as promised, but she didn't seem happy about it, and left with a forced smile. The next day, Mars and Yue walked through the streets after shopping. As they passed an alley, they spotted a figure. It was Shizuku, desperately chewing on a tree near a puddle, which puzzled Mars as he couldn't understand what she was doing. Meanwhile, Ultra and the others were in a tavern, but Ultra seemed more irritated than usual. He was thinking about how he wouldn't be at ease until he reclaimed the reward for conquering the dungeon. Ultra wondered how Mars had survived, and the dungeon was cleared after all of them were paralyzed and unconscious. In his frustration, Gordon burst in with good news, his forehead drenched in sweat after running a long distance. Gordon said his legs felt heavy and he had slowed down, and Ultra considered that it might be time to get rid of him. However, pushing those thoughts aside, Ultra asked why the guild had summoned them, and Gordon announced that Duke Beak had learned they were credited with conquering the abyss of demons and was inviting them to demonstrate their skills. Ultra calmed down and slammed his beer mug on the table, confident that the path to their true S-rank status was still wide open. For years, the Sword of Divine Silver had led with their accomplishments, and now it was time to restore their reputation and prestige. Ultra slammed his hand on the table and declared to everyone that they finally had the chance to establish connections and might even become nobility if they wished. He began to feel that kicking Mars out of the group had been the right decision, as Ultra didn't want to keep anyone without talent on the team. Ultra heard that the land they were headed to had resulted from a war against demi-humans, which led him to speculate that the Lord of House Abik might be a battle-hardened man. So Ultra suggested they show off his Sword Saint skill, and in addition, they could also display Tina's Wings of the Angel skill. However, Tina quickly said that Ultra's skill would be enough, but her nervous tone made Gordon suspect something was off. Ultra sat there with a malicious grin, believing the Sword of Divine Silver would never fail as long as his Sword Saint skill remained. Ultra's Sword Saint skill focused on speed, but what would happen without the dynamic vision skill that Mars had lent him? The group wouldn't realize Ultra had lost the Hawkeye skill until 10 days later. Mars and Yue focused on Shizuku, the werewolf girl, sitting in the alley. When she noticed them, she panicked and quickly ran away, dropping the rotten roots she had been eating. Mars knew that the plant could be used as emergency food, but eating too much of it would cause poisoning and rot the hands. That's where its name came from. Mars wondered why Shizuku had to eat that plant when she should have been paid just the day before. He quickly realized something and told Yue to find Shizuku while he went to meet the man who had hired her. Mars confronted the bald man, who claimed he had paid Shizuku fairly, but only 600 yen, as he had to cut costs to keep the business running. After a heated argument, Mars understood the real reason. The man had reduced her wages because she was a werewolf. This gave Mars a new perspective on how some humans survived in this world. Much like his former teammates, they were willing to exploit and discard others for their own gain, and when someone is no longer useful, they are quick to abandon them. But this bald man was different. He took advantage of others' kindness for profit. The bald man smugly told Mars that his thinking was clever and demanded payment for the information he had provided about Shizuku. However, as Mars pulled out the money, a shadow crossed his face, and he asked the man to hold out his hand. Mars dropped the money into the man's hand, and then activated spatial rupture, immediately severing the man's hand, causing the money to scatter everywhere. A scream echoed through the building, as the bald man realized his hand had been cut off, collapsing to the floor in agony. But Mars showed no sympathy. He picked up some of the scattered money and placed it in the man's remaining hand, asking why he couldn't hold on to the money he valued so much. Mars stood tall while the bald man, drenched in sweat, stared at him in terror, asking what he had done. Mars stepped on the severed hand and asked the man if he knew what Shizuku had eaten that day. But the bald man had no idea what Mars was talking about and said he didn't care. Mars realized that reasoning with this man was pointless, and the only way he would understand his actions was to experience the consequences of exploiting people like Shizuku. Even so, Mars knew Shizuku didn't intend to repay the debt or stand up to the man on her own. Although Shizuku had kept her promise to pay Mars, it meant that Mars was ready to fight on her behalf. Mars had long since lost his pride and honor, but now he felt responsible for facing this man. The bald man argued that Mars had no right to do what he did, but Mars thought otherwise, since the man hadn't paid Shizuku fairly and justified it by saying she didn't deserve the same wages as a human because she was a werewolf. Mars stepped closer, causing the man to scream in fear and back away. Mars explained that he had invested his skills in Shizuku and was now here to collect the profit from that investment. The bald man continued to shout that the money was his, but was interrupted when Mars picked up the severed hand and asked if it was true that the wages had been cut from 3,000 yen to 600 yen. Mars told the man that reducing the wages to 1/5 would be met with the loss of his left hand and both legs, and that Mars could heal them as many times as necessary. This caused the bald man to breathe heavily in fear. Suddenly the walls of the building collapsed, and everyone could see what was happening inside. The room was in complete chaos, with money scattered across the floor, and the bald man's situation was laid bare before the public. The bald man continued gasping in fear as Mars stepped closer and said they could continue their conversation. Mars reminded the man that he wasn't just making empty threats, but he knew that controlling others through fear wasn't the approach he wanted to use. However, he wanted this man to regret his actions, if regret was even an emotion this man could feel. Suddenly there was a knock at the door. It was Yue who had brought Shizuku and asked Mars what they should do next. The room was half destroyed, and everyone outside could see in, but from Mars's point of view, using the door still made sense. Mars decided to activate the skill Blessing of the Seraph and regrew the bald man's hand, before allowing the two girls to enter. The door fell off easily since the entire room had already been half destroyed. Shizuku, the werewolf girl, was shocked by the state of the place. Mars asked how she was feeling, and Shizuku timidly replied that she was fine, then asked what had happened. Mars didn't answer Shizuku's question but turned to Yue, who explained that the werewolf girl had only ingested a small amount of poison. Mars felt relieved, and then turned back to face the bald man, asking about the money again. Fortunately, the man quickly changed his attitude and bowed before Mars, admitting he hadn't paid Shizuku fairly. Mars crouched down and told the man that he would have to give medicine and food to Shizuku. Then, Mars pulled out a bag of money, and took out a gold coin, handing it to Shizuku, worth up to 100,000 yen. The werewolf girl was stunned by the large amount of money, while the bald man looked confused. Surprised that Mars had only taken a small sum, Mars handed the bag of money back to the bald man. Seeing the confusion on the bald man's face, Mars explained that, if he took more, he would be no different from him. Realizing something, Mars handed one of his own coins to the bald man, saying it was to cover the cost of repairing the office. However, just before giving the coin, Mars activated the 6 arms of Ashura skill, and threw the coin at high speed, hitting the bald man on the forehead, causing him to cry out in pain. Mars turned his back and said all debts had been settled, while the bald man, clutching his head, sat up with tears in his eyes. The man glared at Mars with hatred. Mars might have been expecting the bald man to chase after him. As Mars, Yue, and Shizuku left with the money in hand, people began to rush to the bald man, asking if he was all right. He shook his head to clear the pain and raised his head with an angry expression, veins bulging on his neck. He ordered them to call a man named Foreman Eldro immediately. Mars told the two girls that they should bathe and buy new clothes, since there was no reason for them to keep wearing what they had on. He activated his storage skill and stowed away the large bag he had been carrying, then led the two of them to a bathhouse to clean themselves up, followed by a clothing store to pick out more comfortable and presentable outfits. Finally, they arrived at an inn to rest for the night. Mars was surprised to see the difference in Yue as she helped Shizuku, the werewolf girl, dress in her new clothes. Shizuku mentioned that it was the first time she had worn clothes like these, and Mars couldn't believe he had once mistaken her for a boy. Mars called Shizuku over and asked if she really liked the clothes she was wearing. The small girl hesitated, feeling confused, wondering if his question meant the clothes looked strange on her. Mars reassured her that wasn't the case, saying she didn't need to hold back and could choose clothes with more fabric if she wanted. Yu explained that the outfit's design was about style, not cost-saving. Mars joked that he was just teasing her. He put the jokes aside and told Shizuku that the outfit suited her well, which made her even more shy and flustered, tugging on her ears while thanking him for the compliment, adding that she liked the outfit's design. Mars suddenly changed the subject, asking Shizuku about the bald man and why she had backed down from him after not being paid fairly. He wondered why she didn't try to claim the money she deserved, even though she was eating rotten grass due to having no money. Mars tried to encourage her, saying he believed she could win if she fought. But Shizuku finally spoke up, explaining that the werewolf race couldn't use their strength for themselves, no matter how strong the opponent or how frustrated they felt. The small girl suddenly showed determination, declaring that if she found someone worthy to risk her life for, only then could she use the power of the wolf. Mars smiled slightly and told Shizuku that she was truly strong, before slowly standing up, feeling excited to see the legend of the werewolves unfolding right before his eyes. Even if Shizuku was covered in mud and eating poisonous grass, she would never lose her pride. Mars stood in front of her and calmly asked to confirm that she would use her strength for someone else. Shizuku replied that she could do it, but then asked why he was asking. At that moment, Mars quickly explained that an armed group was approaching the inn. Thanks to his sensing skill, he could see about 40 men in armor and armed with weapons. He wondered if they were mercenaries currently in the city. But the most important detail was that the group's leader was the same man who had hired Shizuku, now standing beside the foreman, likely seeking revenge against Mars for what he had done to the bald man. This information sent a wave of fury through Shizuku's body. Mars called her name. He asked her if she could be that person for him, and she agreed immediately, because she would never forget the kindness he had shown her. With that thought in mind, they prepared to face the threat ahead. Mars believed the right decision was to fight, as the werewolf girl could also join in. He asked her if the extended stamina skill he had lent her was enough, and Shizuku confidently said it would be. However, Yue felt it would be too dangerous for her if her skill only enhanced her legs. Mars wasn't worried at all and reassured Yue, as he already knew the situation well. He turned to Shizuku and asked her to confirm that her skill wasn't just leg enhancement. She was silent for a moment in surprise, asking how he had known all along. Mars explained that the information he had gathered from her didn't seem overly complicated, which meant she was likely hiding the true power of her secret skill and fooling others by presenting herself as just a child or a half-beast. Shizuku apologized for lying and explained that she couldn't use the skill for long and hated the idea of being exploited if others knew about her true power. Mars asked her to demonstrate the skill, and after hesitating for a moment, she nodded. She immediately charged up, a blinding light surrounding her body as Shizuku called upon the spirits of her ancestors to bless her with their strength. Both Mars and Yue watched in astonishment as Shizuku activated her skill, Armor of the Fanged Wolf. When the skill was fully powered, energy claws formed around her hands. It was then that Mars realized the legends about the werewolves' unmatched strength in the forest were true. Fangs, claws, and a body covered in fur, all blessed by the wolf god. No one said a word as the werewolf girl declared that she was ready to go, charging out of the room with a determined expression, prepared to fight everyone outside with her true power. The mercenary group continued advancing until a flash of light sent several of them flying into the air. As the bald man and the others looked on in confusion, the bald man finally realized who was causing the chaos: Shizuku, who knew they had come to find Mars. She asked if they wanted money, a woman, or Mars' life. Two of the men laughed loudly and told her to stop. As the four of them explained, they wanted everything from Mars. Shizuku hung her head in disappointment at their response. The foreman drew out a long whip, believing the werewolf girl was trying to intimidate them with the light surrounding her. If these men were here to take everything from Mars, then Shizuku would take everything from them. The foreman threatened her, saying she should try him, and began to lash his whip at her, boasting that he'd teach her how to count with his whip-boosted skill. However, before the man could finish his sentence, Shizuku charged forward. Catching the foreman by surprise, sweat dripping down his face as the werewolf girl repeated his words about learning how to count. She punched him in the gut, shouting out the first count as blood spilled from his mouth. The foreman roared in pain, clutching his chest and stomach as he jumped back to put distance between himself and the small werewolf girl. However, Shizuku didn't hesitate. She pressed forward, kicking him in the face before he could react, continuing her count. Mars sat quietly by the window, letting Shizuku fight on her own, as this was her battle, not his. He began to wonder why she wasn't using her claw skill and questioned whether it was due to her hatred or her kindness. Shizuku told the foreman he could count to 100 billion, meaning this fight could go on forever until he surrendered or was forced to by her hand. He lay on the ground, holding his bleeding face, growling in anger and asking why she was so strong. He believed she was just a dog with a useless skill. Unable to accept what was happening, he punched the ground in frustration. Mars noticed the man's emotions but knew that all his words were meaningless. He recalled the conversation with the foreman's boss and realized something important that day. After talking to the bald man, who seemed to be named Garen, Mars understood that people like him thought Shizuku didn't fight back because she was weak, unable to imagine any other reason. That's what was happening to this man. He couldn't understand or accept the situation. Honor and goodwill were one thing, but there were those who used their strength for evil. To them, if you couldn't fight back, it meant you were stupid and weak. For Ultra and the others, Mars seemed like one of those weak, foolish creatures. What Shizuku was doing now was engraving her message into the enemy's body, showing them that they had made a grave mistake, and that she was far stronger than they could have imagined. This was the first time Mars had witnessed a unique skill used directly, especially with this level of power, possessed only by a select few. Shizuku had a special skill based on her personal abilities and training. This made Mars realize that the skills most people possessed might just be the beginning, and what Shizuku was displaying was the result of tireless effort. Yue watched the battle with admiration in her eyes, asking Mars if Shizuku's skill was different from a unique skill. Mars confirmed that it was. He realized Yue hadn't heard of such skills because they were only mentioned in skill books. He explained that Shizuku's skill was a special skill, a skill that anyone could attain through rigorous training, regardless of race or class. These skills could be found in many places, but there existed another kind of skill, one only a few lucky individuals possessed. Mars looked at Shizuku with respect, understanding that she wasn't just a warrior, but a symbol of perseverance and strength that anyone could strive for, alongside her exceptional skill. Mars felt proud to witness Shizuku's growth, someone he had helped. She was not only displaying her strength, but also showing her unyielding will, which made him feel happy. As the battle unfolded, Mars could feel Shizuku's power surging, and he knew that no one could stop her once she fought with her full strength on this battlefield. Shizuku poured all her energy into her attacks, causing her enemies to tremble in fear as they tried to approach. Mars, feeling excitement rise within him, decided he wouldn't just stand by. He knew it was time to show his own strength and support Shizuku in this fight. Though Shizuku had shown incredible strength, Mars knew that greater challenges might lie ahead, and he couldn't let her face them alone. With determination, Mars stepped into the battle beside Shizuku, ready to fight to protect his new friend and prove that the power of friendship could overcome any challenge. Mars felt uneasy as he witnessed Shizuku's rage explode. The cry of "give it back" echoed in her mind, like a deep plea from her soul. He knew this anger stemmed not only from being treated unfairly, but from a deeper pain she had endured. As Shizuku unleashed her fury and charged into battle, her power surged dramatically, reaching a level of 4064. The enemies she faced couldn't stand against her wrath, and in mere seconds they were easily defeated. The sight of bodies flying through the air and blood spilling from their armor left Mars stunned. Shizuku continued to scream in fury, "Give it back!" Garen, the bald man who had unfairly paid Shizuku, now tried to flee while the mercenaries became fodder for Shizuku's rage. Mars realized it was time to step in and help. He told Yue they should go now, as Mars had an idea where Garen had fled. He activated the spatial jump skill and quickly transported them back to the destroyed building they had left earlier, arriving before Garen could get there. Garen, exhausted from running, was shocked to see Mars and Yue waiting for him. Mars mocked him, saying he was slow and needed to exercise more. But Garen was too focused on his fear, worrying about how they had appeared there. Mars understood that Garen was searching for something underground. The man couldn't comprehend how Mars knew, but Mars reminded Garen that he had buried his severed hand beneath the ground before Shizuku and the others arrived. The reminder sent Garen into a state of confusion and panic. Mars knew that Garen wouldn't escape easily and was determined to ensure he faced the consequences for his cruel actions. Mars was ready to confront the enemy and do whatever was necessary to protect Shizuku and others who were weak. When using the spatial jump skill, one wrong input in the coordinates could result in someone getting stuck inside a wall. Thus, using sensory skills to scan the destination was crucial. When Mars buried his hand earlier, he had sensed strange underground spaces, indicating that there might be a hiding place for Garen. Garen, with anger in his voice, drooled and asked if Mars was trying to stop him from escaping. Shizuku called Mars a demon, and Yue asked if Garen was joking. Mars replied that it was best to assume so. He turned back to Garen, and calmly explained that no matter whether he ran or fought, death would be certain. It would be like a house of straw to Shizuku. With one blow, it would all be over. The mercenaries fought because they were paid, but Garen was different. He was just a civilian. If Shizuku did something terrible to him, it would be considered a crime. These words made Garen think that Mars intended to protect him, but that was far from the truth. Mars had made up his mind that someone as cruel as Garen didn't deserve any protection, and he was willing to do whatever was necessary to ensure justice for people like Shizuku. Yue asked if Garen's words were a joke, and Mars agreed, leaving the small man confused about the situation. Mars then ordered Garen not to move a single step as Shizuku was on her way. Mars asked Garen if he had forgotten about his skill, that he could regenerate a severed arm, meaning Mars didn't care how Garen ended up because he was sure he could still restore him later. Shizuku arrived only seconds later with a blank expression, her mana power reaching 81,937. As soon as the werewolf girl appeared, Garen desperately pleaded for Mars's help, but Mars didn't move, just watching with a tired expression as Shizuku unleashed her rage on him. The building echoed with screams of pain and fear, and eventually, the battle was over. 3 days later, Mars and the others were strolling through the town trying to keep their heads low, as it seemed like every citizen was paying attention to them, though not for negative reasons. An elderly man approached them and asked if the three had a destination. But Mars declined, saying where they wanted to go was just around the corner. Mars felt exhausted from having so many people talk to him and wondered how many times this had happened that day. Yue was there to answer, and she said it had been 8 couples and 14 individuals. Right after Shizuku defeated Garen's group, people discovered nearly 40 mercenaries brutally beaten on the streets, causing a major uproar in Kanui. Everyone could only talk about how Garen had fought with a great traveller, only to be defeated by that very traveller. The town had returned to peace after the rumour spread. This wouldn't have been a problem if it weren't for the constant interactions with the townspeople. They were greeted by citizens asking about the weather. Some came to inquire about the powerful skill that had taken down the mercenaries, and others seemed to ask Mars if he had a girlfriend, only to back off quickly when they saw the 2 women with him. Even though Mars didn't answer those questions, people still bothered them, spreading rumours or looking at the 3 with newfound admiration, all because of Garen. Mars wondered what the bald man had done to make everyone hate him so much. The werewolf girl couldn't understand why Mars wanted to spend money instead of keeping it. Mars explained that spending money locally would help boost the town's economy, which could benefit Shizuku and others in the future. Shizuku looked at Mars with bright eyes, sensing the sincerity in his words. She couldn't help but feel warm inside, knowing that, despite hardships, there were people like Mars willing to help. Yue also seemed convinced. Shizuku asked about their plan. Mars responded that they could buy food, clothes, and other necessities for their journey, all while supporting the local people. Shizuku nodded in agreement, finally feeling she could contribute to the community, even though this place didn't hold good memories for her after everything that happened. Yue disagreed, telling Mars he should think about himself more. Mars said he didn't want the people here to suffer because of the mistakes of one individual. Yue quickly agreed with his decision, even if she didn't fully understand the meaning behind it. With that decision made, they began planning their shopping, and Shizuku felt more excited than ever, not just for the new things, but for the chance to do something positive for others. Mars used his spatial jump skill to transport them. They arrived at a jewelry store. The werewolf girl quickly realized this was the only store in town where they could spend 700 million in one go. She had never set foot in such a luxurious place before, and neither had Mars. All three of them entered the jewelry shop. They were greeted by a black-haired woman. Mars placed a bag of money on the table, surprising the black-haired woman. He requested to find jewelry suitable for the three of them, which left Shizuku astonished. The black-haired woman glanced at the money and thought for a moment. She turned and promised to find items worthy of 747,631 yen. Mars watched in awe as she disappeared behind a curtain. When the long-haired woman returned, she carried a tray with sparkling jewelry. They were 3 necklaces made of gemstones originating from the queen of the werewolf tribe. This detail caught Shizuku's attention. Meanwhile, Yue was captivated by the fact that they were the queen's gemstones, which held a stronger mana source than any other gems. The black-haired woman had also learned about their identities and knew Shizuku was a werewolf, thinking these would be perfect for them. Mars offered it to Shizuku, but she declined, saying the gift was too expensive. In the end, though, she reluctantly put it on. Shizuku suddenly asked Mars a question. Mars looked at her with surprise as she led him outside the jewelry store. The werewolf girl, with a shy expression, seemed unsure how to express herself. Mars, Shizuku began in a soft voice. I want to thank you for everything you've done for me. Mars smiled, happy to hear her sincere gratitude. There's no need for that, Shizuku. I'm just doing what I think is right. You deserve better. But Shizuku couldn't shake her desire to repay him. I know, but it truly means a lot to me. I want to do something for you. Mars could sense her sincerity, and it made him think. If you want to do something, believe in your abilities and keep moving forward. That's the best way to thank me. Shizuku nodded, but her eyes still gleamed with determination. I want to help you in any way I can. I don't want to just be someone who receives help. With this bond, Mars felt even more excited about their journey. Together, they would accomplish great things, and Mars knew Shizuku would not only be a companion, but also a powerful warrior in the future. When Mars heard about Dungeon Faraway Azure, he was intrigued. An S-rank dungeon could bring many opportunities and valuable rewards. If it's an S-rank dungeon, I'll need to prepare carefully, he said, quickly deciding. I'll help you. This was the only thing Shizuku could ask him to help with. Seeing Mars's attitude, Shizuku hurried to apologize, thinking it made him uncomfortable. Shizuku pleaded, gripping Mars's hand. Tears began to roll down her face. Mars looked into her tear-filled eyes, feeling the urgency in her voice. You want me to go to Hidden Wolf's den and help save it? He asked, filled with determination. Yes, Mars. My hometown is in danger. A terrifying monster has appeared in the area, and only someone like you can help us. A sense of joy spread through Shizuku, and she couldn't hide the smile on her face. Thank you, Mars. I knew you wouldn't let us down. Meanwhile, Ultra and his group were still enjoying their luxurious life in the carriage, where they were treated like nobles. Ultra held up his beer, laughing loudly. This is the life. Nothing better than enjoying good food and beer, he said, slapping Gordon's shoulder, who frowned. Gordon furrowed his brow, looking around. This is strange. We used to be monster hunters, and now we're being treated like nobility. But I can't help thinking about Mars. He could be in trouble. Ultra nodded. Yes, but he has talent. I'm sure he can handle himself. Still, a part of Ultra couldn't fully relax, worried about his former comrade. Elia was distracted by the speed of the carriage, while Tina admitted that she felt sorry for Mars for missing the chance to ride in such comfort. Gordon remarked that there wouldn't have been enough room for all of them anyway, as the carriage could only hold 4 people, making Ultra laugh loudly. He joked about how an S-rank dungeon boss hadn't yet been defeated and was growing to maturity, causing monsters to spill out from the dungeon. This could be prevented by conquering the dungeon before the monsters escaped. Guilds were formed to prevent situations like this, and in a traditional event called the debut show, adventurers would try to catch the attention of nobles to earn rewards for their teams or guilds. There were even cases where adventurers succeeded in these events and were granted titles by the nobility. This was exactly what Ultra and his group were aiming for. The debut show location was only a day's walk away, but Duke Beak had sent a carriage to pick them up. clearly showing the Duke's eagerness for their abilities. Tina mentioned that if their journey took longer, it wouldn't be a problem. Ultra agreed, pouring himself more to drink. The carriage driver called for the attention of the Sword of Divine Silver members, announcing that they would soon be leaving the city, and warned them that the ride would get a bit bumpier. However, even with that, the driver assured them that the carriage, even on rough roads, wouldn't spill anyone's tea. While this might have been true, the driver didn't anticipate encountering wild boars on the road out of the city. As Ultra was sipping his drink confidently, he was quickly humbled when it spilled all over him, right after declaring there was nothing to worry about. He yelled in frustration as the drink soaked his clothes, while Gordon covered his face either to stifle laughter or for another reason. Ultra stuck his head out the window to scold the driver for making the long-haired swordsman spill his drink on his new armor, and the driver quickly apologized. But just as Ultra realized there were wild boars on the road, he was confused as to why they were on the main path. Ultra ducked back inside the carriage and tried to order Gordon to do something about the situation, but Gordon kept his hand over his mouth, claiming he was feeling a bit car-sick after the recent jolt. Ultra then turned to call Elia, who was still sound asleep despite the commotion, and meanwhile Tina, the group's healer, didn't seem capable of fighting. So, Ultra decided to handle the problem himself and fight the wild boars as a warm-up for their trip to Duca Beak. A pair of boars, often hard to deal with even at A rank due to their venom, didn't faze Ultra. He believed he could handle it. He activated his Sword Saint skill, and one of the boars was quickly killed. But Ultra soon realized that things were happening faster than usual, and he was about to collide with a nearby tree. Ultra groaned in pain, clutching his body and gripping his sword, wondering what had just happened. He still believed he had the Hawk's Eye skill and could see his enemies when using Sword Saint. But now he couldn't see anything. Ultra decided to blame his troubles on having drunk too much, and he took a deep breath, aiming his sword at the remaining boar, believing that the impact had sobered him up and that he would now finish the next one cleanly. He activated the Sword Saint skill again. The second boar was killed as expected, but not as cleanly as Ultra had hoped. His sword got stuck in the ground, and he was thrown several meters, writhing in pain once more. The long-haired swordsman was even more confused until he had a flashback of what Mars had told him about returning everything they had borrowed. This information caused Ultra to start hyperventilating and foaming at the mouth. With only 1 day left, Ultra would have to perform his Sword Saint skill at the debut show, and in what felt like the blink of an eye, the day of the debut had arrived. People gathered around the seats of a large arena, while Duca Beak stood proudly from the highest balcony. Another man stood beside the Duke, announcing the Sword of Divine Silver team would be performing their debut. The 4 members stood side by side, waiting for the man to continue speaking. Gordon stood firm. Elia appeared confused and tired, while Ultra and Tina were sweating nervously. Tina showed the most emotion, knowing something might go wrong during the performance. The announcer declared that the group would showcase the skills they used to clear the demon territory, and asked them to demonstrate before the entire audience. Ultra knew this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, and he couldn't afford to fail, especially not in front of a noble. The long-haired swordsman was determined to showcase his combat skills successfully, earning Duca Beak's approval and securing his place among the nobility. The announcer went on to explain that the nobles had arranged an A-rank team to prepare the monsters Ultra had requested as opponents, while the A-rank team watched the performance and guarded the audience in case anything went wrong. Ultra began sweating again, growing anxious, knowing things wouldn't go as smoothly as he hoped. However, he tried to reassure himself that everything would be fine as long as he could strike the enemies immediately, even if he couldn't see them. The monsters Ultra had requested were hard-shelled creatures that would keep fighting even if their heads were cut off. The mad warriors of the subterranean ant army. Though the gates hadn't opened yet, Ultra knew around 50 of these creatures were ready to fight. Gordon called out to Ultra, asking if they should say something to the nobles and the audience before starting. The long-haired swordsman took a deep breath before loudly declaring that they would crush the monsters with their swords and bring forth a rain of blood for everyone to enjoy. This lack of professionalism caused a few women to turn away, holding their mouths to stifle laughter, while Duca Beak stood silently, waiting for what would happen next. Ultra said it was time to begin, and whispered to Gordon to keep quiet and hold the line, asking him to try to gather the ants around him as much as possible. Gordon was confused, but agreed. The debut was now underway. As the gate slowly opened, the ants began pouring out. Gordon slammed his shield into the ground, quickly activating his obsidian skill as the ant army poured out from the wooden gates, gathering into a group and charging toward them. Gordon didn't hesitate. He seemed ready to face the creatures as they swarmed his shield with great force, their mandibles beginning to gnaw at it. Gordon growled in frustration and exhaustion, watching the strength of the ant army as they began to cluster together, pushing against the shield with more power than just a few ants could muster. Ultra praised Gordon for his efforts and raised his sword, instructing him to keep holding the ants at bay. Ultra began activating his Sword Saint skill, but as expected, he couldn't control it without Hawkeye. As a result, he charged into the arena wall with a loud crash, causing Gordon and the audience to gasp in shock. A displeased expression crossed Dukabeek's face, while a group of A-rank hunters standing on the sidelines looked on in surprise. Gordon was confused, frowning as he asked what Ultra was doing. Ultra began to stand as rubble fell to the ground beside him, glancing nervously at the Duke before jumping back, pretending nothing had happened. Ultra told the Duke that he was just feeling a little nervous and would win the fight with his next attack. But Dukabeek remained silent throughout the exchange, his faith in the swordsman clearly starting to wane. Ultra turned back to face the ant army and attempted to activate the Sword Saint skill again, but it failed. He collapsed and slid across the ground. He tried again, but once more he failed, crashing again as the ants continued crawling toward Gordon. The long-haired swordsman started to worry about how the debut was going, knowing his actions had embarrassed him in front of everyone. Still, he tried to stay calm, though it became harder with each passing second. He nervously joked, saying he was just messing around, laughing awkwardly as rubble continued falling on his bruised and anxious face. Tina watched with a terrified expression, weakly calling out to Ultra, while Elia remained silent, staring off into the distance. The A-rank hunters wondered if Ultra really couldn't see his enemies. Another hunter said it was impossible, given Ultra's Hawkeye skill. However, more and more hunters started discussing amongst themselves, remembering that Hawkeye was a skill borrowed from Mars, and they questioned whether it had been returned. It became known that the other team members had also borrowed skills from Mars. All the hunters began wondering how many skills Mars had actually lent to the members of the Sword of Divine Silver. Ultra slowly stood up while Gordon looked on in concern. He realized Ultra had lost Hawkeye just by observing his condition. That explained why Ultra couldn't track the speed of Sword Saint and why he kept crashing into walls. At that moment, the A-rank hunters knew, though it was hard to believe, that the Sword of Divine Silver's success had been due to borrowing a large number of skills from Mars. Gordon called for Tina to do something and heal Ultra with her Wings of the Angel skill, which she gasped at and agreed to do. However, when she hesitated and raised her hands trying to activate the skill, nothing happened, only silence. Gordon began sweating, watching everything fall apart before him. Tina tried activating her skill again, but nothing worked. She started gasping for air, realizing the power of the angels had truly vanished. Tina collapsed to the ground and began crying as Gordon tried to encourage her to stay strong. While Ultra continued his attempts to use his skill but kept failing, Elia knelt beside Ultra, and he begged her to use ancient magic to boost his strength. However, she replied that it wasn't possible, and thought the next best thing would be to put some of her saliva on her finger and dab it on Ultra's face, claiming it would help his wounds heal faster. Unexpectedly, Ultra remembered Dukabeek's presence and gasped as he turned around, only to realize that the Duke and the other nobles had already left, with only a closed door remaining. A look of horror spread across Ultra's face as he screamed in fear at the sight of the closed door, while Gordon was overwhelmed by the swarm of ants, shouting for help. In the end, the A-rank hunters and Dukabeek's guards had to step in and assist the four of them, and thus concluded the worst debut in history. A week had passed since the confusion and failure of the group's debut, and Ultra was seen sitting in a chair, disheartened by what had happened to the four of them. Elia was recounting the grim situation, mentioning that days had passed since they last saw Tina, and Gordon had locked himself in his room. Ultra wished that the meeting request he sent would be accepted, giving him a chance to explain himself and try to prove his worth to the Duke. He asked Elia about the reply from the letter they sent, which the butler had promised to deliver once ready. Elia looked up at the moon and said it would be arriving soon. Suddenly, the wooden door creaked open, and as Elia had predicted, the butler arrived with the response to Ultra's letter. Ultra stood up from his chair, as the butler withdrew and handed over a scroll to the long-haired swordsman. He waited anxiously, slowly taking the scroll while Elia stood behind him. He gripped the scroll tightly, pleading with the butler for a face-to-face meeting with the Duke, believing that if he could talk to him, everything would be fine. But the butler interrupted him, pushing another letter into Ultra's hands, the Duke's response. It was a rejection. Ultra couldn't accept this reality. He threw the papers to the ground and declared he hadn't been feeling well that day. The butler raised his hand, showing 3 fingers, telling Ultra to listen, as there seemed to be a misunderstanding. He explained that the Duke did not like people who relied on excuses, though he had shown mercy towards the group. One finger lowered, counting down the chances Ultra had left before everything fell apart. The first chance had been missed when Ultra failed to report the issues with his skills before the performance, a responsibility that could have earned them another opportunity in the next 2 or 3 months. But even though it was something Ultra should have done, he had been too proud to admit it. Human nature, the butler understood, often led people to push forward until they could no longer continue, and the Duke would have still shown compassion even if Ultra had failed during his attack. Finally, when Ultra fell on his first sword thrust, it was clear that his strength was waning. However, the second finger lowered as the butler explained that Ultra continued to push after his failure. Ultra was puzzled, unsure of the meaning, but the butler asked how many attacks Ultra had attempted with his uncontrollable Sword Saint skill. Ultra couldn't answer out of shame. The butler explained that it was not impossible that if one of Ultra's attacks had struck a lord or lady, the consequences would have been clear for the members of the Divine Silver team. Prison, torture, hanging. Ultra collapsed to the floor, feeling overwhelmed. As the butler excused himself to leave, he still advised the young swordsman to keep an open heart and appreciate his life. Ultra tried once more to beg the butler for a chance to speak, but the only response from the man in the suit was that if there was a natural disaster or a rebellion, that would be Ultra's only chance to catch the Duke's attention, as the Duke was the overseer of this land. The butler believed there might be another opportunity for them to meet, though the chances were very slim. After that unfortunate day, the butler quickly departed, leaving Ultra and Elia behind. Elia placed a hand on her chin, pondering the fact that she hadn't been completely rejected. Ultra began pounding the ground, leaving dents in the wooden floor, as he screamed in rage, clutching his hair and yelling about how everything was ruined, all because of Mars. Elia had lost her ability to use magic, Tina had lost her healing power and disappeared. And even though Gordon still had his obsidian skill, he had locked himself away after being traumatized by the ant swarm attack. Ultra's path to becoming a noble and his future had crumbled away. However, the long-haired swordsman only dwelled on it for a moment, before he grabbed a wooden beam and cried out in joy. He believed there was still one last chance to prove the strength of the Divine Silver team, the genius alchemist Angelina, who would replace Mars after he was kicked out. She hadn't arrived yet, but Elia mentioned that she had received word that Angelina had arrived in the city that very day, which only fueled Ultra's excitement over this new opportunity. Ultra believed his future wasn't over, and they would soon find a breakthrough, thinking that this was what the butler had meant when he spoke about keeping an open heart. Somewhere in the city, a girl sat on a chair, talking to a small creature made of stone in her hand. This was Angelina, the alchemist Ultra had been eagerly waiting to meet. She told the small creature that she would go to the guild the next day, though it was already late. She was excited, wondering what kind of person this skill lender might be. The next day, Mars and Shizuku stood facing each other as the skill return process began. The time extension skill would be returned to the black-haired boy. Energy glowed around the girl, before flowing back into Mars. Shizuku lowered her head with a disappointed sigh, thinking this meant goodbye to the perfect power of the armor of the fanged wolf skill. Mars reassured the little wolf girl that she hadn't completely lost the skill. He could lend it to her again later if needed. But the wolf girl felt bad knowing that she could usually only use the skill for about 10 seconds. Suddenly, Yue congratulated Shizuku because she could still use the time extension skill without it being lent to her. The girl was confused, until Mars explained that it had become her real skill. This only confused her more, but Mars promised to explain why she had learned the time extension skill after they completed their next task. As they left the room through the door, they were surprised to see an older man standing right outside. It was the mayor. He leaned on his cane and asked Mars and the others about something while they continued living in the town. Yue and Shizuku were puzzled as Mars invited the mayor inside to explain the task more clearly. Mars sat on the bed, eagerly waiting for the old man's next words. The mayor quickly got to the point and immediately requested that Mars and the others take on a monster extermination job, as it was an issue that couldn't be ignored. For the past few months, monsters near Kanui had become increasingly active. Mars already knew this, having fought around 80 creatures on their way to town. The mayor had tried to protect the town by hiring about 40 mercenaries, but they all fell ill before they could do their job. This made Mars and Shizuku look at each other in shock, realizing they were the ones who defeated the mercenaries that one night. The mayor noticed the wolf girl's confusion and raised his hand to reassure her, telling Shizuku that while Garen and the mercenaries were responsible for that incident, the town still needed to do something about the monsters. He needed someone to replace the 40 mercenaries, and there was no one else besides Mars and the others. Yue asked Mars what the plan was, and he hesitated, thinking. He knew this was an unexpected job unrelated to saving the hidden wolf village. Shizuku mentioned that the monster activity could be linked to the dungeon, and that was enough for Mars to realize they couldn't let the situation worsen, so they would handle the issue, at least until replacements arrived. Mars stood up, announcing to the others that they would depart immediately. They stepped out of the building and into the forest, where Mars activated Scout's insight and God's eye. He detected around 100 monsters wandering nearby, but this was no problem for the dark-haired boy, as he quickly sliced through all the creatures in mere seconds with his spatial techniques. As they continued walking, Mars saw this as a good opportunity to continue the conversation. He explained that typically, people would need to study or practice hard to accumulate 1,000 skill points before learning a skill. But he did it for others, before lending them the skill. If someone used the skill more, it would grow stronger and even evolve. Mars clarified that more specifically, he lent skill points, SP, to people before lending them the skill, for a period of 10 days or more. Although he could only lend one skill to one person at a time, there were times when he could lend range-enhancing skills to one person, affecting the entire group. Shizuku was impressed, and remarked that he could lend 1,000,000 SP to create an army. But Mars explained the process of interest, saying that returning a large amount of SP within 10 days was impossible, and would be dangerous without knowing what would happen. There were still many unexplained aspects of this skill that Mars didn't want to approach recklessly, so he wouldn't lend anything Shizuku couldn't handle. The wolf girl thought for a moment and calculated, realizing that using the skill had increased her SP enough to still be above 1,000 after returning it to Mars, which made her excited. She eagerly asked Mars if he could lend her another skill. However, Yue suddenly appeared behind her and explained that her thinking was similar to someone in debt and feeling desperate. This scared Shizuku. She said she understood. Shizuku stood watching the others gather materials, her tail wagging happily, at the sight of the storage skill Mars was using. Mars noticed her actions and asked what skill she wanted, and she replied that she wanted the storage skill he had. However, Mars had to explain to her that it was a combination of 3 different skills working together. If there were indeed a regular skill like what Mars was doing, it would be too powerful and dangerous. He thought about what it would be like to carry all the materials he gathered on his back, but that idea was terrifying. Mars continued to explain how his storage skill worked, and Shizuku understood that the dark-haired boy would create an ice cage with the cocytus skill before using the spatial jump skill to send it flying upward. The wolf girl thought he was referring to the sky, but Mars corrected her, saying there was a place called the Sea of Stars, a location discovered by an adventurer in the past who never returned, leaving only records of the place. He would store things there rather than anywhere else, because too much was happening on the surface and underground that could harm the items he wanted to hide. Someone had taught Mars something in the past. Choose your skills based on interaction, but Mars knew that was not something Ultra had ever considered. He spotted a branch shaped like a sword stuck in the ground, and picked it up, thinking that Ultra must have realized the loss of the support skills for Sword Saint, making the skill too overwhelming for the long-haired swordsman. The branch crumbled in Mars's hand. As he looked up at the bright sky, the wind blowing through his hair, before Yue informed him that a horde of monsters was approaching them, he turned to Shizuku and asked if she was ready, as she activated both of her skills and charged toward the monsters. 4 days later, when the replacement mercenaries arrived in Kanui, all the monsters around the town had been exterminated. After completing the monster extermination mission, Mars, Yue, and Shizuku decided to report their accomplishments to the mayor and take on another task. Mars felt a bit mentally exhausted and politely asked Yue to handle the situation, to which she did not object. They entered the building and sat on one of the sofas inside, facing a curly-haired woman with glasses. The woman greeted them and asked how she could assist them today. However, Mars asked her first who she was. She introduced herself as the mayor's secretary. The secretary asked again about their business, and Mars firmly placed a large ice chest on the floor, which had materialized from thin air, filled with monster parts and materials from their battles. He told her they were there to report the monster extermination and were delivering proof of their completed task to the mayor. The secretary was startled by the sudden appearance of the chest, but when she looked inside, she began sweating in astonishment at the amount of materials inside. Just from this ice chest alone, which Yue confirmed had the secretary worried. Yue hoped the secretary could sell the materials separately from the reward they were to receive for completing the task. For this reason, the group had brought the chest to the building along with 12 other ice chests outside in the garden, further shocking the secretary. The secretary wondered what she should do, knowing that these materials could bring a high value at the guild, estimating that the contents of just this chest alone were worth over 10 million yen. Finally, she spoke up, saying this was impossible, making Yue wonder if that meant she didn't want to accept the materials. However, the secretary quickly corrected herself, explaining that her words didn't mean she wanted to break the deal. Rather, such a large amount of gold could wipe out the town's savings and tax reserves. Yue looked toward the dark-haired boy who nodded at her, and she told the secretary they could lend the materials for free, allowing them to sell them before paying Mars and the others. The secretary agreed to the terms, and with that, the three left after receiving the mayor's approval. Mars stared at the papers confirming the agreement between the mayor, the secretary, and himself and the others. It explained they would be paid in gold, or through reasonable cooperation over the next 10 years, due to their help in gathering so many materials from the extermination. The dark-haired boy told Yue the deal was good and thanked her for her help. She reminded him to let her know if there was anything else she could do. Mars wondered why she said that, and asked if he had been too cautious or if his face had shown any negative emotions. But Yue replied that she didn't believe that was the case. Still, Mars knew he was a little tense, as they had found themselves in an interesting situation. The three of them had caused quite a stir in this town due to their actions. The faraway Azure dungeon lay near the surviving wolf village, meaning the village might not be in good condition. He knew the materials would be needed to restore the village, and the potential for gathering some from Kanui was high. However, Mars realized that gathering too many materials to restore the village would raise suspicion. He wanted to build a fair relationship between humans and wolves and establish a good connection with the people of Kanui. Therefore, it was better not to hide anything from the start. Finally, after pondering the issue, the dark-haired boy spoke up, explaining that they could still gather materials through the mayor as a cover, keeping the news from leaking to the public. He stood up and caught the wolf girl's attention, asking Shizuku if she agreed. This made her silent for a moment before she said she didn't mind. Shizuku told Mars that he didn't let people die or take away anyone's power, so she believed Mars's method was the only way that could work. Mars turned to Yue, who nodded at him. It was time to move on to the next step in their journey. If the demi-human race had lost the war and were stripped of their rights, Mars would do whatever he could to help them. And so the three of them set off to clear the distant blue dungeon. Someone, barely keeping their eyes open, called Shizuku's name and asked where the short wolf girl had gone. The surroundings showed a completely destroyed environment with blazing fires consuming the village. The identity of this person was unknown, but they referred to Shizuku as their daughter, indirectly telling her not to return to the village, as the faraway dungeon was controlled by the enemy's will. They didn't want to die yet, feeling that it wasn't their time. This person knew they hadn't told Shizuku the name of the devourer yet. Mars and the others were now walking through the forest, with Shizuku leading the way. She was the only one who knew the location of their nest. Mars only knew information about the wolves from stories and legends. He decided this was a good opportunity to ask the girl about the history of the wolves, and she shared what her mother and father had taught her long ago. The wolves were driven out by the war against humans, forcing them to hide in the forest. The men, the elderly, and the weak were killed in the battle, while only the women and children, along with other non-combatant tribes, escaped. The wolves could only survive on the land they chose, the mountains, as it was far from humans. Shizuku mentioned that the remaining wolves were her grandfather and a few relatives. Mars began to understand everything more clearly. They were all possessors of the special skill Armored Fang Wolf, and found more meaning in the land they lived on than their original homeland. Shizuku continued the story, explaining that their strength began to weaken as the forest slowly disappeared due to the greed of hunters who wanted to destroy the surrounding nature for industrialization, or completely ignored the efforts the wolves had put in. As the forests began to be destroyed, the wolves fled, and eventually settled in a valley that humans could not enter, even if they wanted to. The wolves were able to live peacefully in the remaining forest. That was the history of the hidden wolf village. As the three continued walking through the forest, Mars started to familiarize himself with the terrain, but he noticed the rocks around them becoming brittle and the ground dry and sandy. The weather had extreme temperature fluctuations, unlike anything typically seen elsewhere in the world. The wolves' living area was a harsh environment, something Mars slowly realized as all three of them breathed heavily throughout the journey to the den. He turned to ask Yue if she was all right, but she replied that she was fine. They followed Shizuku deeper into the forest as the temperature began to rise. Mars thought that no one could have imagined that demi-humans had lived in secret in such a place for 3 generations, let alone the existence of an S-rank dungeon. Shizuku added that the dungeon was a dangerous place, though the wolves continued to gather meat and materials from it. Shizuku added that the dungeon was a dangerous place, though the wolves continued to gather meat and materials from it, doing whatever they could to survive. even drinking monster blood when necessary. Shizuku stopped and gazed into the distance where the village was nearby as the wind swirled around them. But something felt wrong. In the distance, something unusual caught Mars's attention. He activated his God's Eyes ability to closely examine the village ahead. He told Shizuku that there was smoke, but it didn't seem like smoke from cooking or a simple accident. Even though Mars remained calm, Shizuku immediately grew anxious, explaining that smoke was forbidden in the village. She started trembling, sweating in fear, convinced something terrible had happened. Mars instantly grabbed both girls by their waists and shoulders, activating his spatial jump ability, transporting them directly above the village, which was engulfed in flames when they arrived. Shizuku stared in horror, while all three of them were bewildered by the unfolding chaos. Mars asked Shizuku which house was hers, and she pointed to one not far away. She began reaching toward her home, struggling in Mars's arms, but he urged her to stop, telling her they needed to act quickly to help the situation. Mars activated his Asura's 6 arms skill, punching through the insect-like monsters swarming the village. While 2 of his arms continued holding Shizuku and Yue, he landed on the ground and punching through the insect-like monsters swarming the village. Nothing could stand in Mars's way, as he annihilated every creature in his path toward Shizuku's home. Yue turned to ask Mars if he was hurt, but he shouted that he was fine, and they were almost there. Shizuku spotted monsters closing in on her house, which ignited her rage. She broke free from Mars's grasp, activating her Armor Fang Wolf ability. She screamed at the creatures, demanding they stay away from her home, and fiercely tore through the monsters with her bare hands, before rushing inside with a panicked expression. The wolf girl found her parents lying on the floor. They were unconscious and badly burned. She cried out to Mars, saying they weren't breathing and were severely injured. Mars knew the house was unsafe and said they needed to move her parents outside, before he could heal them using his Seraph's Blessing ability, just like he had done to save Garen earlier. The burns on her parents' skin slowly began to fade, and they were now stable, though still unconscious from inhaling too much smoke. Shizuku clutched one of her parents' hands, pressing it to her face, whispering her gratitude to Mars, tears of joy streaming down her cheeks at the thought of her parents still being alive. Mars stayed silent for a moment, looking around the village, still wondering what was happening. The strong prey upon the weak to grow stronger, while the weak are hunted down and become weaker. It's the law of nature. However, to fight against that nature, humans seek wisdom and build civilizations, cultures. But what Mars witnessed now were people who had been stripped of everything, no longer allowed to stand against the disaster from the dungeon. They had lost their land, families, dignity, and now their very lives were at stake. In the end, nothing in society had changed, and these people could only remain silent. They built a society and chose a king. But if humans continued this way, where would there be room for wolves and other races? Yue interrupted Mars's thoughts, asking if they should save the villagers first. But Mars responded that their priority was to kill the boss, deep in the dungeon to stop the flow of monsters in the area. He asked Shizuku if she could protect the villagers on her own. She hesitated slightly. Seeing this, Mars decided to give her another skill. The lending process began before she could react, and Mars told her that he would give her the Scout's intuition skill so she could sense danger. The wolf girl didn't understand why he gave her this skill with the enemy right in front of them, but Mars explained that it was so she could flee. He wanted her to have the chance to escape safely if she ever felt too overwhelmed and unable to fight, even if it meant leaving alone. Shizuku felt insulted by his suggestion and firmly declared that she wouldn't run, even if it meant risking her life. Mars agreed with her determination, but he wanted her to survive. It's a natural human instinct to believe that survival is a victory, but wild animals think differently. Merely existing isn't enough to be called living. Mars's suggestion might have seemed selfish, but surprisingly Shizuku understood this. Still, she stood her ground, promising she would never flee. Mars told Shizuku that they would part ways from here. He would go and defeat the boss to stop the monsters from attacking the village, while Shizuku would stay and protect the villagers. He wanted her to promise him something, but knowing she might hesitate, he didn't ask. However, she understood what he wanted and reassured him that she wouldn't throw her life away so easily. She held out her hand and the two of them locked hands in a promise. Shizuku was about to tell them where to go, but Mars said it wasn't necessary, as her priority was to protect the village. The two then set off on their separate missions, and it would be a long time before they would meet again. Shizuku continued tearing apart every monster in her path, while Mars asked Yue about the source of the creatures. She clung tightly to his back as he sprinted up a dirt road. Yue mentioned that the spawn point was likely to the west of the mountain, and the entrance to faraway Azure might be there as well, based on the direction the monsters were moving. However, the journey wouldn't be peaceful as more creatures began swarming from behind, catching both of their attention. Mars tilted his chin, instantly obliterating them with a skill from his arm, ordering them to stay out of his way, as they were mere insects compared to his mission. He leaped forward at incredible speed, continuing up the mountain path, realizing it was well maintained and easy to traverse, meaning this could be the route the wolf villagers used to reach the labyrinth. Yue lifted her head, looking at the building growing closer. Mars declared that this must be Faraway Azure, with monsters pouring out of its entrance without any sign of stopping. As Mars neared the dungeon, he realized that every second mattered. He told Yue that he was counting on her, and she nodded in acknowledgement. His skill was activated through Yue, as she selected the obsidian skill from Gordon and evolved it into the adamantine barrier, a stronger version of the original skill. Gordon's SP had now reached its minimum, and the maximum SP would be automatically collected from him until the SP debt was repaid. One of the insect-like monsters lunged toward Mars, but he instantly activated the adamantine barrier, blocking the attack and sending the creature flying. Mars finished with a punch, causing the monster to explode. Every attack from the creatures became meaningless as the adamantine barrier was heavier than lead and repelled every type of strike, unmoved by even the strongest blows. By combining its weight and hardness with a forward charge, the shield acted like a cannon. More and more monsters flew or crawled toward him and Yue, while Mars fully unleashed the power of his Azura six-armed skill, creating what he called the Great Ram with a single swift movement. Mars pierced through all the monsters effortlessly, killing each one, slashing through them as he soared into the dungeon's gate. He told Yue that they would conquer this dungeon in one go, and she agreed without hesitation. War is known as a contest for survival. Although people may offer many reasons for it, the true nature of war is a struggle for dominance, rather than merely protecting one's territory. Naturally, the victor in battle will conquer, while the defeated will be subjugated. At the first level of the Faraway Azure dungeon, Mars and Yue raced through the corridors together, destroying any stray monsters they encountered. In Mars's mind, thoughts about why humans created culture and civilization spun around. He believed it was because they wanted to distance themselves from war. Humans, in his view, were special and unique, unlike animals because they built civilizations and redefined the laws of nature. That's what made humans truly human. But if this ultimately led to war, with the strong hunting the weak, then what was the point of civilization? As they descended the stairs, Mars paused and signaled Yue to stop. He said they would take a short break to plan their next move. The fourth level of Faraway Azure was an endless sea, with waves crashing gently against the sand. This seemed strange, but Mars realized that in an S-rank dungeon, anything was possible. Yue looked at the moving waves, tilting her head curiously before kneeling near the shore. She scooped up some water and prepared to drink it. This action startled Mars, and he quickly called for her attention. However, there was nothing to worry about. As Yue explained, the water seemed fresh, pure, and non-toxic, just like spring water. Mars sighed, looking at her with tired eyes, accepting the new information. His heart had nearly jumped. He advised her not to do things like that without thinking, reminding her that they didn't know what dangers could be hidden in dungeon water. To be safe, Mars healed her, just in case there was something harmful in the water. They both gazed out at the vast water again, and Mars told Yue that dungeons always bring something new and unexpected. There were reports from adventurers who had seen landscapes in A-rank dungeons and skies in S-rank dungeons. Each dungeon was diverse and beyond human imagination. Mars guessed that Faraway Azure was a dungeon of oceans and water. Yue asked if they should use spatial jump to cross it, but Mars explained that wasn't possible, as the lake stretched endlessly. Moreover, there were swarms of bees in the air, and countless sea serpents beneath the water. The water splashed as massive snake-like creatures emerged from the lake. Mars knew it would take a long time if he had to jump repeatedly while dodging monsters. Yue asked him what they should do next, and Mars pondered for a moment, before deciding they should cross by boat. He used his Kakaita skill to create an ice boat. They carefully stepped into the boat, and Mars activated the adamantine shield around it before setting off, just as the serpents rushed toward them. Next, Mars activated the Song of the Divine Era skill to search for ancient magic and determine the direction they needed to sail. He then used additional skills to cast Stormwind, propelling the boat swiftly across the water. The serpents and swarming bees began to pursue them, making Yue anxious as she reported the situation to Mars. However, he remained unfazed, telling her that he would use even more skills, layering them to make the boat even faster. The wind behind them would slice through any creatures that came close. Mars told Yue that he would use the Great Ram skill, combining earth and water layers, to speed through without delay. Meanwhile, at the hidden wolf village, Shizuku's parents slowly regained consciousness. Her father removed the blanket from his body and sat up, looking at himself in confusion, wondering what had happened. He remembered the house being attacked by monsters, fighting them off until the flames consumed their home, causing him and his wife to pass out from inhaling too much smoke. The wolfman glanced at Shizuku's mother before looking down at his hands, perplexed that both of them had survived and that their wounds had healed. Realizing the building they were in wasn't their home, he got up and stepped outside to assess the situation. Suddenly he saw his daughter outside, bravely fighting off the monsters. Upon hearing her father's voice call out to her, Shizuku turned around, overjoyed to see he had woken up. Her father asked how she was able to use the **armor-fanged wolf ** skill for longer than 10 seconds. She explained that someone had lent her the power to extend the use of that skill in battle. Excitedly, Shizuku continued talking about that person and how they were on their way to stop the monsters in the dungeon. However, her father interrupted with a worried shout, his expression darkening, as he clenched his fists. He told her that there was a very strong enemy in the ** faraway Azure ** dungeon, but his daughter tried to reassure him that there was no need to worry, as the person she knew could defeat hundreds of thousands of monsters. However, her father interrupted and explained that there was an enemy of their people inside, the one who had released the monsters outside. Shizuku, confused, asked who her father was referring to. He finally revealed that their enemy was ** Dukabeak **. Meanwhile, Mars asked Yue how long it would take them to reach the lowest level of the dungeon. She estimated about 30 minutes. This information didn't sit well with Mars. Instead, he felt time in the dungeon was moving too slowly, and they needed to act quickly as they approached the mini-boss room. Using his Asura's 6 arms ** skill, Mars and Yue leapt through the air at high speed, but Mars noticed something ahead and stopped to hide behind a rock. Yue, confused, kept quiet as he instructed, sensing there were others in the dungeon. A group of 4 people, wearing a familiar family emblem on their shoulders, came into view. The emblem signaled they belonged to the Abik family. Mars was perplexed because no one was supposed to know about this dungeon, let alone soldiers from the ** Abik ** family. Suddenly, one member of the group sensed Mars and Yue's presence, turning around and calling them out from their hiding spot. Both of them immediately stepped out without hesitation, causing confusion among the 4 soldiers. The man who called out to them asked if they were members of a guild and demanded to know their names and affiliations. Mars replied truthfully, stating he was a former guild member. The soldier recognized Mars's name from Sword of Divine Silver, though he didn't know Mars had left the guild 3 weeks earlier. But everyone in the group seemed unaware that he had left and burst into hysterical laughter, making Mars realize the guild's reputation had crumbled. They mentioned how Ultra had embarrassed himself in front of the Duke a few days ago, but Mars didn't care and wondered why they were telling him this. The swordsman explained that they were there to conquer the dungeon on behalf of the weak and frail guild after the guild had left it behind. Mars realized that his former party members had come here by choice, not under Dukabeak's orders. He kept these thoughts to himself, while the swordsman continued talking, warning Mars not to underestimate an S-rank dungeon if he intended to reclaim his honor. This confirmed Mars's suspicion that they were unaware he had long since left the party. Mars asked if they had informed the Duke, and the answer was no. The swordsman revealed they intended to clear the dungeon and later pretend they were dealing with the monster attack. This meant the Duke still didn't know about the hidden wolf village. Mars planned to capture these soldiers and erase their memories after conquering the dungeon. Yue clutched her necklace, sensing Shizuku waiting for their return, and the two tried to move on with their mission. However, the swordsman ordered them to stop and tried to grab Yue as a threat. Mars quickly pushed her out of harm's way, keeping her safe, but the soldier snatched Yue's necklace and threw it into a nearby mud puddle. He feigned a slip of the hand, though it was clearly intentional, and they told Mars and Yue to hurry and find it before the pendant was lost forever. The group of soldiers confidently walked away, believing they had gained the upper hand over Mars. When they were out of sight, Yue apologized and said she would search for the necklace, but Mars reassured her that it wasn't necessary. They could find it together. He reminded her that the gemstone on the necklace was important to the wolf tribe. Conquering the dungeon wasn't their only goal. They also needed to help save the wolves. Mars told Yue they could search for the necklace, while the 4 soldiers would be busy fighting the mini-boss in the meantime. Since the necklace was sinking into the mud, they needed to find it quickly. Yue smiled and agreed happily. Just before the soldiers passed through the door leading to the mini-boss, the swordsman laughed one last time unable to believe he had run into someone from the Divine Silver Group. After some searching, they finally found the necklace, and Yue joyfully thanked her master. Neither of them got dirty, as Mars had used a polishing skill to clean off the mud. He was relieved to see her looking so happy after retrieving the necklace. Now, it was time to check on the 4 soldiers and see what they were up to. Mars raised his hand to use a detection skill without needing to enter the room. He remembered how confident the soldiers had been in their abilities, which suggested they should have defeated the mini-boss by now. However, all Mars could sense was a giant slug inside, completely unharmed despite the time that had passed. Yue tugged on Mars's cloak to get his attention and pointed at the ground, where they could see blood seeping out from beneath the door. This confirmed for Mars that the soldiers had not fared well inside, and that they would have to handle the situation themselves. Mars opened the door and was immediately attacked, but he countered with his spatial rift skill, slicing through the tentacles that lunged at him. He looked around and saw that 3 of the soldiers were already dead. He spotted the girl curled up in a dark corner of the room, desperately trying to hide from the slug. She was huddled in a fetal position, her body trembling violently in fear as she kept muttering under her breath that divine punishment had befallen them. Mars asked what she meant, but the girl was too terrified to speak coherently and could only beg for help. Mars promised he would help if she answered his question truthfully. His question was about what the group had done, and the girl explained that their leader had lured the monster with a strong-smelling drug. Mars understood that acting on one's own without permission would result in punishment in the military, and the leader likely did this to avoid being penalized. However, regardless of the soldiers' circumstances, what mattered now was that the monster had been released intentionally. Mars set those thoughts aside to focus on getting to the boss as soon as possible, telling the girl and Yue to stay where they were. Mars advanced toward the giant slug monster and used his Cocytus skill to freeze it, but the creature's high defense made the attack less effective. Yue suggested he attack from the inside, but Mars wasn't focused on defeating the mini-boss. His goal was to conquer the dungeon as quickly as possible. He called it luck that they had encountered this boss, confusing the 2 girls with his remark. Right after Mars used the spatial jump skill to launch himself and the giant slug into the air. He told them to close their eyes and cover their ears, before sending the massive creature crashing down into the ground, leaving the girl utterly confused. Yue explained that Mars was trying to create a hole to descend straight to the lower levels, and he succeeded, breaking through all the way to the 14th floor. After descending to the next level with ease using his new trick, Mars didn't stop. He kept lifting the giant slug and smashing it down repeatedly, destroying it over and over, taking the group down to the 15th floor. Then smashing further down again, Mars pounded the giant slug all the way up to the ceiling of the floor where Yue and the girl stood before shoving it down to the next level, completely wrecking it. The girl was shocked to discover that dungeon floors could actually be broken. Mars confirmed this, saying every adventurer had once dreamed of digging straight from the first floor to the last at least once. However, no one had ever succeeded in breaking through the floors, which made everyone believe they were indestructible. The girl was still confused about how Mars could manage this, especially since he was just a porter for the Divine Silver Group. But Yue, standing beside her, suddenly emitted a dark aura at her words, causing the girl to apologize hurriedly. Yue calmed down and informed her that Mars had left the group long ago. While listening to rumors was normal, it was always better to verify the truth for oneself. Eventually, Mars broke through to the 20th floor, but he still didn't stop. He kept smashing and smashing until the only thing that shattered was the giant slug. Mars was surprised and almost impressed when the slug crumbled, but it was a good sign as it meant the floor they stood on was special and indestructible. Considering how many floors Mars had broken through, it was likely the next one would be the final floor of the dungeon. The girl realized that everything had gone silent, and Yue wondered if Mars had descended so deep they couldn't hear any noise anymore. But soon enough Mars, with his dark hair, flew back up to bring the 2 girls down to the next level. Mars told them that they had finally reached the bottom of the S-rank dungeon, and now it was time to defeat the boss and conquer it. However, the girl in the soldiers' group collapsed to the ground, drawing Mars and Yue's attention and leaving them puzzled. Mars asked what was wrong, while Yue extended her hand to help the girl, but she refused to move, trembling with fear. She kept repeating that humans couldn't run on water or fly in the sky, and breaking a dungeon floor or conquering an S-rank dungeon was also impossible for humans. Yue asked the girl's name, and she introduced herself as Mero Brand. Yue quickly corrected Mero, saying humans could actually run on water if they put their left foot forward before their right foot sank. This response confused Mero, who said it was nearly impossible. Yue replied that while it was true, it wasn't completely impossible. Nearly impossible and truly impossible were two different things, and at this moment what Mars had achieved was nearly impossible. Mars told Yue it was time to go, and the two left the girl sitting there as they jumped down to the deepest level of the dungeon. They brought a piece of the shattered giant slug with them and landed without issue, then moved forward, to face a giant frog sitting atop a pyramid-like pedestal. The creature croaked angrily upon seeing their presence. Mars noticed the frog couldn't completely hide its agitation and asked if it hadn't expected an enemy to descend from above. After all, adventurers usually entered through a door at the end of the stairwell between floors. Regardless, Mars proceeded to freeze the slug piece and told the frog he didn't have time to play with it, as he had a friend waiting for him back at the village, fighting to protect her home. The frog tried to lash its tongue toward Mars and Yue, but the dark-haired boy was faster, and launched an ice shard at the boss, killing it instantly as the shard pierced through the frog's head. Thus, the battle ended within seconds. At the hidden wolf village, Shizuku was still struggling to fight off all the monsters attacking the village, but she was starting to feel exhausted, gasping for breath as bruises appeared on her small body. She looked up with wide eyes, when she saw a giant mantis-like creature standing in front of her, towering over her and the entire village, which was still ablaze. The wolf girl looked down at her claws, believing she needed to push herself harder to protect her home. Shizuku called on more strength from her armor Fang Wolf skill. But even with the time boost from her time enhancement skill, the earth warned her that she had reached the limit of the mana she could borrow. Still, she felt she had to reclaim the home her ancestors had fought to protect. For that reason, Shizuku resolved to destroy everything trying to take away the place she cherished and clear the path for her bloodline to live on. She screamed that no one should say it's okay to run away so easily. Shizuku remembered she once thought the same when she heard the weak words from the townspeople in Kanui. She wanted those thoughts silenced in her head, and in her anger she charged at the mantis, shouting that a person cannot call themselves human just because they are still breathing. Mars knew this but still advised Shizuku to flee and save herself. She saw him as someone stronger than anyone she had ever known, which made her certain he would conquer faraway Azure. And that motivated her to protect the place she called home. Shizuku was nearly at her limit, but she would endure until Mars returned. She ran up the side of a nearby building before leaping down, dodging the mantis's swing, and slicing off the creature's head with her claws. The wolf girl landed back on the ground, and she slowly stood, even though her body trembled violently from exhaustion. She congratulated herself for ending the long fight. This mantis, she believed, was similar to the dungeon's commander, but her joy was interrupted by her scout's intuition skill, which alerted her to more monsters approaching the village. There were too many mantises for her to continue fighting. At this point, she had reached her limit. Her father noticed this and told her she had done enough and should retreat, but Shizuku sensed a powerful force that wasn't from the enemy, and told her father not to worry. She was right in the end. With the Great Ram's skill, Mars, Yue, and the girl they found in the dungeon had stormed through all the mantises and landed near where Shizuku stood. The wolf girl looked up in amazement as Mars's large figure became visible through the settling dust. The dark-haired man said he would handle things from here, but Shizuku, confused, focused on asking about the dungeon, and Mars quickly replied that he had conquered it using his God's Eye skill. The remaining monsters were only those within the village and the nearby valley, but Mars had no intention of letting any escape. He asked Shizuku if all the hidden wolf village's residents were behind them and away from the battle, and she confirmed immediately, as her father had confirmed earlier. This meant there would be no problem with Mars wiping out the rest of the monsters. Mars told Shizuku he was glad she had made everything clear, and he told everyone around to take cover. He raised his hand and activated his windstorm technique, Aeolus. A massive cyclone formed in the sky, swirling around the dark-haired man, as all the monsters were sucked into the powerful vortex with no chance of escape. Thousands of creatures screamed and cried in confusion and fear as they were hurled into the air at incredible speed. Shizuku was in awe as everything flew upward in a blur. Mars soon used and combined both spatial rupture and cocytus, creating an ice blade that sliced through each monster in an instant. All that remained in the sky were tiny shards of sparkling ice, and everyone in the village, including Yue and Shizuku, watched in amazement. At that moment, the frozen remnants of all the monsters, reflecting the sunlight, fell onto the mountains like a symbol marking the end of this disaster, after a long and arduous battle, extinguishing the flames of the hidden wolf village. Mars and Yue sat down on cushions, while the rest of the village gathered before them, bowing their heads in respect and gratitude. Shizuku's parents thanked Mars and Yue for saving their daughter and the village, introducing themselves as Asagi, the village leader, and Kasumi. Asagi expressed regret, saying they couldn't prepare any gifts, but he wanted to do his best for Mars and Yue. Mars responded by thanking the wolves for welcoming them during such difficult times. Suddenly, Shizuku's father offered Shizuku to Mars as a concubine if he wished. This startled both Shizuku and Mars, leaving them confused and panicked. The dark-haired man quickly replied that this might be a bit too much. Asagi understood, especially noticing Shizuku's discomfort. Mars tried to explain that Shizuku was the young lady of the wolf tribe, but Asagi countered, saying he carried royal blood within him, though he lacked the qualities to call Shizuku a princess. Hearing this, Mars asked more about the story related to rebuilding the village, and Shizuku's father explained that the wolf tribe once had a king. However, there was still a sense of emptiness, as a symbol had been lost in the flames of war. While the tradition may have ended that day, Mars was puzzled and asked Asagi what Sogi meant. The wolf pointed to the necklaces that both Mars and Yue were wearing, explaining that the gemstones were the symbols that had returned to their people. They were called the Queen's Jewels, and their purpose was to signify the three individuals who would sit on the throne: the king, his lady, and the heir. Each of the three would hold a gem, passing them down through generations. Asagi and Kasumi had feared the gems were lost somewhere in the valley, but fortunately, they remained safe. The wolf then lifted a sword he had kept beside him, catching Mars's attention. Asagi unsheathed the blade, explaining that the sword must also be held by the one who sits on the throne, and it was called a katana. A dwarf blacksmith who once lived with them forged the blade, and it was created by the blacksmith's ancestors. Mars examined the sword carefully, noticing its slight curve and easily recognizing that it had not been crafted by any human. The gems and sword in Mars's hands would prove the right to become the king of the forest. But upon hearing this, Mars moved to hand his gem over to Asagi, and Yue also intended to give her gem to Kasumi. Asagi raised his hand to stop them, explaining that Shizuku had told them Mars traveled without a destination. If they were looking for a place to settle, Mars could become their king. Asagi's family, along with the other wolves, all watched Mars and Yue intently. They awaited a response from the dark-haired man. After a moment of silence, Mars finally spoke, telling Asagi that his thoughts might not be clear, as he had nearly lost his family. Moreover, Mars had not even spent a full day in the village. He said his answer was no, but Asagi still tried to convince Mars, asking if he knew the laws of the wolf tribe. The law was that everyone should use their strength, not for themselves, but for others. Mars had already known this from what Shizuku had told him. Asagi explained that even though Mars possessed great strength, he used it for the benefit of the wolves and had returned the gems without hesitation. The wolf raised his hand as a signal, and all the demi-humans in the room immediately bowed, surprising both Mars and Yue with their gesture. Asagi continued, explaining that wolves bow before those who are strong and above all proud, regardless of race or age. This reflected their true desire to have the strongest one lead as the king of the land. Mars began to realize he had misunderstood the wolves, learning that their law was to choose the greatest warrior as king. Asagi pleaded with Mars to take the sword and allow them to hunt, farm, and fight for him, while the dark-haired man would end his journey in their village. Mars understood that his journey had no destination, and there was no harm in accepting their offer. However, just as Mars reached out to take the sword, Yue stopped him, reminding him that she wanted him to choose the path he could truly accept. Mars decided to decline the offer, and he said there was something he wanted to ask of the wolves. He walked out to the courtyard where everyone was gathered around a cage, and inside it was Mero. He explained to everyone that she had been hiding in the dungeon, and was part of the group that released the monsters from the dungeon for their own greed. Mero confirmed this, causing the surrounding wolves to look at one another with shock and anger. They began arguing about how to punish her, each offering different suggestions. The matter had consequences for them all, until they agreed that the punishment for Mero should be death, as vengeance for the pain and anger she had brought upon their village and people. One among them approached the cage, holding the body of a dead child, asking why the woman still lived while the child did not, begging her to return the child to them. Mero looked down in sorrow and shame, preparing to say that she couldn't do that, but her words were interrupted by a voice asking what she would do if she could. She was surprised by the presence of the voice, wondering where it came from, until Mars explained he could speak to her using sound waves, with his voice reaching her alone through his spatial jump skill. Ignoring that, Mars immediately returned to the topic, asking if she would want to revive the child after he lent her the healing skill, a blessing of the Seraph. But it would come at two costs, her skill and her lifespan. No one knew exactly how much life would be lost, whether years or decades. While Tina could use it safely when combined with other skills, she had never dared to use it. Mars asked Mero again if she would accept the offer and do something, rather than merely feeling remorse for her crimes, even though it could lead to her death. In the end, Mero agreed after hearing this. Mars nodded, and he told the wolves to listen to his idea. Before long, Mero had used the borrowed skill to revive the child. The little girl gasped for air, and asked if anyone else had died, but the child was the only one who had perished. Still, the people debated what to do with Mero. Even though she had restored life, it didn't erase her crimes, and her punishment had yet to be decided. Suddenly, Shizuku stepped in, saying that no one had listened to Mero's story. One of the wolves tried to explain that it was hard to accept her reasoning after what she had done. But Shizuku insisted that Mero should have the chance to speak, as it wasn't fair to decide without hearing from her. The demi-humans gathered around the cage, while the girl knelt, pleading with them to let her use the healing skill to restore and revive her teammates, those who had fought with her for 6 years, even though they had done unforgivable things. Mars couldn't help but remember his own past, and the people he had fought alongside. The girl continued, explaining that she would persuade her teammates and devote herself to making amends while trying to negotiate with the Duke. Shizuku stared into her eyes, asking if she was willing to do this, even if it might cost her life. Mero didn't hesitate to confirm. Not allowing someone to help those who could be saved was the same as killing them. Shizuku was satisfied with what she had heard from the girl. She turned to ask the others if they were satisfied. Though punishing Mero harshly wouldn't change anything, they would keep her and her team around to gather resources from the faraway Azure dungeon, and perhaps one day they could negotiate their return to the hidden wolf village. Mars watched everything unfold until he was once again offered the sword. After a moment of thought, he accepted the offer, and Mars declared that he would become the king of those who had been dispossessed and reclaim what had been taken, to create a new future. All the wolves bowed to Mars once more, agreeing to follow him on that path. The next day, Mero left the village, ready for a new journey, until Yue noticed and asked where she was going. It seemed Yue had opened the gate for her, and Mero had tried to slip away before anyone realized. However, Yue reminded her that her escape had been anticipated, thanks to the wolves' keen sense of smell and hearing. Knowing no one was stopping her from leaving, Yue gave her a gift, a piece of ritra that Mero could use to craft a potion, which would help restore the lifespan she had lost, so long as she made it to a distant town of scholars in the west. Mero was confused, not understanding why she was receiving something so valuable. However, Yue had a message from Mars for her, telling her that the Sword of Divine Silver was truly only third-rate. Hearing this, Mero began her journey. She left a message with Yue, saying that she would thank Mars the next time they met. Meanwhile, Mars, Yue, and Shizuku continued their journey, but quickly encountered a large stone golem with a gem embedded in its chest. Yue was curious about the golem, and Mars explained that it was an earthen doll created by an alchemist, brought to life by the power of the earth, with its size dependent on the creator's skill. Worried, Shizuku asked what they should do. Mars instructed the wolf girl to return to the village and lead everyone to safety. He was determined not to let the golem go any further. At that moment, a woman appeared and asked if he was the skill lender. She introduced herself as Angelina, the alchemist, and explained that she had been searching for him. 2 months before meeting Mars, Angelina had arrived at the guild and was warmly welcomed by Ultra and Elia. They had thrown a party to celebrate her joining the Sword of Divine Silver. Angelina reluctantly thanked them, but was confused to only see 2 people, and wondered about the skill lender. While Elia stuffed her mouth with food, she asked Angelina about alchemy, which sparked the alchemist's enthusiasm. She started talking non-stop about how alchemy is magic that turns the impossible into the possible, though it often required enduring repeated failures. Yet this challenge made alchemy fascinating to Angelina, as she dreamed of discovering something she couldn't yet achieve. Both Ultra and Elia agreed that dreams were important, and just as Ultra was about to discuss the group's terms, Angelina immediately lost interest and turned away. The long-haired swordsman, confused, tried to stop her, but his efforts only made Angelina more bewildered. Ultra was about to ask why the alchemist was preparing to leave. When he looked down and realized something, Angelina turned her back, embarrassed and annoyed, while Ultra hurriedly explained that he had only looked down due to their height difference. Returning to the topic, Angelina explained that she was there to meet Mars, the skill lender. Ultra, however, insisted that a skill lender wasn't necessary, claiming that he alone was enough for the group. Angelina sighed deeply, expressing her lack of interest, and asked if the swordsman understood the value of a skill lender. She explained that if her power was combined with Mars, their synergy would become so powerful that they could accomplish almost anything. Angelina had travelled far to find what neither of them could achieve alone. Ultra still tried to persuade her to stay, but Angelina knew it was pointless to join a group that was no longer functioning. After thinking for a moment, she came up with an idea. They would settle things by playing a game. The two stepped outside the guild, and people began gathering around, eager to see what would happen. The alchemist girl explained that this would be a one-on-one duel between them, and Ultra stubbornly agreed, even though deep down he knew things might not turn out well. However, he felt he had no other choice but to accept the challenge. She knelt down on the ground, and he believed it was time to start the duel. Angelina placed her hand on the ground and quickly activated her Earth Golem skill. As Angelina activated her skill, debris flew everywhere, and dust clouded Ultra's vision. From behind the dust, two glowing eyes shone through the haze with an ominous aura, as something seemed to rise from the ground, making Ultra recoil in shock and fear. However, his shock quickly turned into confusion, as he stared at the unexpected scene before him. As the dust settled, Angelina stood tall, revealing a tiny golem, no more than a foot tall. While the long-haired knight stared in disappointment, Angelina looked down at the golem and called it adorable, adding that if it could be reborn as a human, it would one day be her husband. Ultra raised an eyebrow and asked if this tiny golem was all he had to fight. This question offended Angelina, who declared that the golem was her future husband. She explained that, although the golem was only temporarily alive, she believed it would one day be reborn as a person, and they could get married. Feeling confident that defeating the tiny golem would be easy, Ultra readied himself. But Angelina just smiled, waiting for Elia to give the signal. Elia, still chewing her food, raised a skewer of meat and lowered it like a flag to signal the start of the duel. Ultra charged forward with determination, certain that the golem would move slowly due to its nature. However, Angelina warned him not to rely on common sense. She activated the golem's jump ability, and it disappeared from Ultra's sight. Startled, he stopped and looked around in confusion. Angelina pointed to the sky, and Ultra looked up, stunned to see the golem plummeting toward him from above. He barely dodged as the tiny golem slammed into the ground with incredible force. The long-haired knight stood there, mouth agape, while the alchemist explained that golems had a special ability. They could mirror the skills of their creator. Ultra couldn't believe what he was hearing. Angelina told Ultra they would continue and activated the jump skill again for the golem. This time Ultra seemed more confident, standing tall and claiming that now that he understood the golem's trick, things would be easier. He prepared to activate his holy sword skill. But suddenly, something burst from the ground, holding his legs in place. Confused, Ultra watched as Angelina began counting down. Before he realized what was happening, the tiny golems hit him hard from behind. Angelina stood over him with a sweet yet eerie smile, asking if he was ready to surrender. Ultra, too stubborn to give in, replied that he wouldn't surrender to someone who loved a golem. This only made Angelina angrier. She reactivated her Earth Golem skill, summoning more golems that surrounded the area. She explained to Ultra that she could bring anything from the earth using her golems, transferring her skills to each one. With a wicked grin, she asked if it wasn't tragic that he, a skilled knight, was being beaten by a girl not even loved by humans. Ultra attempted to clarify that he never said such a thing. Angelina immediately responded by activating the golem's jump ability again, continuing her assault on Ultra. In the end, Ultra lay defeated under the weight of the golems, his body twitching as Angelina walked over to Elia, complaining about how hard it was to find a husband. Elia tried to comfort her, saying she would find someone one day. Suddenly, Angelina remembered something she wanted to ask Elia. The next morning, Ultra woke up with a scream. Elia greeted him calmly, complaining about how hard it was to carry him to the inn, and that she had needed help from the villagers. The long-haired knight asked where Angelina had gone, only to hear that she had left the city, causing Ultra to pull at his hair in frustration over their ruined chances. He glanced to the corner of the room, and noticed that Mars's luggage, which they had asked Gordon to retrieve from the Devil's Abyss, was gone. Ultra asked where it had gone, and Elia casually replied that Angelina had asked for it, and she had handed it over without hesitation, since they were friends who shared meals together. Ultra wondered why Angelina would want something like Mars's gear. But Elia explained that Angelina had mentioned her golems were trained to track scents, meaning she could find Mars. Ultra, surprised by this revelation, told Elia to get ready to head to the bell tower, as they were going to track down Angelina. They climbed to the top of the tower, scanning the city for the alchemist. Elia caught Ultra's attention, saying she had spotted Angelina on the trail of Mars's scent, making Ultra grin brightly.